Just after 9 on a black Atlantic evening, a biplane made of canvas and wire came in low and dropped one torpedo. It struck the stern of the largest battleship in commission with any navy. It did not sink her, and it did not silence a single one of her guns. It bent one rudder and tore the other away, and left her turning into the weather in a wide, helpless arc, 600 miles from the nearest friendly harbour, with the whole of the British home fleet closing from the north. 2,200 men were aboard her. 7 days earlier, she had sailed to hunt cargo ships, and in those 7 days, she had not sunk a single one. What happened to her over the following hours has never been agreed, not by the men who fired on her, and not by the men who lived. If you are drawn to the great ships and the disasters that took them, subscribe and stay to the end, because what finished the newest battleship in the world was a chain of very small things. Chapter 1. A giant launched on a false number. More than 60,000 people stood in the yard at Hamburg that February afternoon to watch a lie slide into the water. It was a Tuesday, the 14th of February 1939, and the weather had come out kind. A bright winter day of sparkling sunshine on the flags, the scaffolding and the long grey flank of the hull. For the better part of 3 years, she had been construction number 509 at the yard of Blohm and Voss, a shape growing on Slipway 9 under the plain cover name Ersatz Hanover, replacement for Hanover, as though the largest thing the yard had ever built were a dutiful stand-in for a tired old ship. Her keel had gone down on the 1st of July, 1936. Now the shores were coming away from her sides. The ceremony began at 1 o'clock. At 34 minutes past, she was afloat, and the whole business was over, because a launch is a very short piece of theatre. A hull that has stood still for years moves once, gathers speed for a few seconds, and then the sea takes her weight, and she rides. The crowd would have felt the ground shake and then felt it go quiet. One rule marked the day out from any peacetime launching. Cameras were forbidden among the guests. Only official agencies were allowed to take pictures, so that every image of the biggest hull Germany had ever put into the water was made by a man working for the state. She was named for the Chancellor, who had made the country she was built to serve, and the sponsor was his granddaughter, whose name comes down in the records as Dorothee von Loewenfeld, and also as Dorothea von Loewenfeld. That she was a granddaughter of Bismarck is confirmed. Her exact place in the family is not, and the christening line quoted in 100 books has no authoritative source behind it at all. What does survive, word for word, is the speech given by the man standing under the bow. He called her the first giant of a new squadron of 35,000-ton battleships. He named the German and English fleet agreement as the reason the figure was 35,000. He closed by asking that the spirit of the Iron Chancellor pass into her, and 60,000 people applauded. The number he had said aloud was false, and the men who had drawn her and built her knew exactly how false it was. Germany had chosen, in the words of one naval research organization, to proceed with a ship of 42,000 tons standard displacement and to attempt to deceive the British and the Americans regarding their size. The draft of these 35,000-ton ships was therefore officially reported as 25 feet and 11 inches, 7.9 meters. How far over the line she really was depends on which authority is asked. One modern reference puts the overrun at some 7,000 tons, Garsky and Doolin at 7,600. British and American naval constructors were skeptical from the day she took the water, and they were right to be. The false number had a long chain of paperwork behind it. Versailles had capped German capital ships at 10,000 tons, a limit meant to leave the country coastal defense and nothing else. The Washington Treaty of the 6th of February, 1922, set the great powers a ceiling of 35,000 tons and 16-inch guns. Then, on the 18th of June 1935, Britain signed an agreement allowing Germany a fleet in the proportion of 35 to 100, a ratio the document itself described as a permanent relationship. In practice, it came to 184,000 tons, or in the phrase used at the time, 535,000-ton battleships. An escalator clause lifted the ceiling on any single ship to 45,000 tons from the 1st of April 1937. Two countercurrents run against the simple story of a treaty broken in secret. The tighter limit may have been the ground itself rather than the paper, and on the 11th of February 1937, the construction office told Raeder that the new ships could not exceed 42,000 long tons because of the depth of German harbours and the German Canal. The defence offered for the design is that it sat inside the raised ceiling anyway, and that none of the other naval powers kept themselves inside the old one either. What is beyond argument is the draft. That number was written down by men who knew it was wrong. Set the deception aside, and the ship underneath it was extraordinary. 251 metres from stem to stern, 823 feet and 6 inches, on a beam of 36 metres. More than 90% of her hull was welded instead of riveted. 22 watertight sections ran from her stern to her bow, 17 of them inside an armoured citadel about 170 metres long, close to 70% of her waterline, an extent the historian José Rico calls by far the greatest of any modern battleship. Her main battery was 8 guns of 38 centimetres in 4 twin turrets, and the Kriegsmarine gave the turrets names rather than numbers: Anton and Bruno forward, Caesar and Dora aft. Each gun threw an 800-kilogram shell at 820 metres a second, out to a maximum of 35,550 metres. She carried 1,004 rounds for them, about 125 for every barrel. The claim that these were the fastest-firing heavy guns ever built has never been supported by anything in the record, and it does not need to be. 8 barrels of that size, well laid, were enough. She cost 196,800,000 Reichsmarks, $79 million at the exchange rate of 1939. Run that forward by consumer prices, and it comes to roughly $1.8 billion. Measured instead against the size of the economy that produced her, which is the honest way to feel a national effort, it lands somewhere between 7 and 26 billion. A modern American destroyer costs about 2.2 billion. Germany spent the price of a fleet on a single hull and told the world it weighed 35,000 tons. The claims that grew around her need sorting carefully, because the story only works if the numbers hold. Largest warship afloat is a claim she cannot quite carry. She outweighed the Hood by about 834 tons standard and 2,564 tons fully loaded, and the Hood was 262 metres long to her 250, 11.7 metres longer, so every popular line about her being bigger than the Hood is a weight claim sold with a picture of length. Further away, in a yard in Japan, Yamato had been launched on the 8th of August 1940 and lay afloat and secret through the whole of Bismarck's career. The defensible version is the largest battleship in commission with any navy in May of 1941, and that is quite enough. Fastest battleship in the world is simply false. She was 3rd or 4th. Richelieu had been making 32.6 knots in service since June of 1940, and Vittorio Veneto and Littorio matched her at 30. The version that is both true and frightening is that no Royal Navy capital ship of comparable fighting power could catch her. Most heavily armoured ship afloat is overstated without being baseless. Her 19,000 tons of plate and her protected length lead the comparative tables, and her belt of 320 millimeters was thinner than Richelieu's, thinner than Rodney's, thinner than King George V's, and far thinner than Yamato's 410. Then there is the word that clings to her hardest, which nobody appears to have used while she was alive. Mark Carlson went through the German and British archives looking for it, and reported that careful research reveals not a single public proclamation before 1941 of Bismarck as the most powerful or the biggest battleship in the world, and that not even the War Ministry or the Propaganda Ministry seems to have made such a claim. The unsinkable ship is an invention of the years after the war, and it traces to a line of dialogue written for a film in 1960, given to an admiral who never said it, and repeated until it hardened into fact. The nearest thing to an official German boast is the careful, bounded phrase used at the launch, the most powerful warships ever built in Germany. What was true about her was enough to keep the Admiralty awake at night. And the truest number of all, the one the men who drew her cared about more than length or speed, was the weight of her armour. 19,082 tons of hardened steel, 40% of her designed combat weight. The weight was real. Where it sat was another matter, and one of the men who had drawn her had already looked at where it sat and gone quiet about it. Chapter 2. The armour that guarded the wrong thing. 40% of her designed combat weight was armour, and almost all of it was in the wrong plane. 19,082 tons went into her protection, a greater share of a ship than any rival then in service carried. Yamato, larger in every other way, carried a heavier weight of plate at 22,895 tons, and it came to only 33.2% of her. Armour is the part of a warship that nobody photographs and nobody admires. It is also the part that decides, on one afternoon out of a whole career, whether a crew lives. Her belt was 320 millimeters of hardened plate, 4.8 meters deep and 170 meters long, hung along her side like a steel wall standing in the water. Above it ran a thinner upper belt of 145 millimeters. Forward, she wore 60, aft 80. The faces of her turrets were 360 millimeters thick, and her forward conning tower had sides of 350. Anything arriving flat along the surface, at the ranges battleships had fought at in the last war, would meet a very great deal of metal. The trouble was the roof. Her main armoured deck lay low inside her, the flat of it sitting 1 metre above the designed waterline and about 10 metres above the keel, 80 millimetres thick over the machinery and 100 over the magazines, though Okun and also Garsky and Dulin read that magazine figure as 95. From the edges of the flat, sloped plates of 110 to 120 millimeters ran down and outward at 22 degrees to meet the bottom of the belt, an arrangement the Germans had used since before the First World War, and which the English-speaking literature calls the turtleback. A shell coming in almost horizontally had to punch the belt and then climb the slope. A shell falling steeply out of the sky at the end of a long flight from a long range had to do neither. Okun worked out what her horizontal protection was actually worth, taking the decks together rather than one plate at a time, and arrived at 112 millimeters amidships, 125 over the magazines, and 121 over the steering gear. Every contemporary he measured her against stood at 127 or better. She was, on his arithmetic, the thinnest roofed of the modern battleships, and yet by sheer weight of armour and the length of hull it covered, she led the table. The finding that stays in the mind is a window. Between 15,600 and 16,000 yards, and nowhere else, a shell could arrive at the one angle that carried it through her deck into the spaces that mattered, 400 yards wide. quarter of a mile of range in a fight conducted at nearly 9 miles in a seaway from a moving platform against a moving target. Okun found 2 other things. Her weather deck, the plating above the armoured deck, was in his judgment counterproductive, one of the very few cases where adding armour to a ship reduced her protection, and he found a narrow band of falling angles between 26 and 28.7 degrees, a sneak path to the magazines. His own words for what a hit along that path would do were hits that can blow up the entire ship. 2 correctives travel with all of that, and they stay in. Okun never called the scheme outdated or obsolete, or any of the other words later writers have put in his mouth, and his own conclusion runs against his own critique. Increasing all of the ship's armour by 50%, he wrote, would not have made a single ounce of difference. Jose Rico goes further, arguing that an Iowa-class battleship in heavy seas, 600 miles from the nearest harbour, with both rudders jammed 12 degrees to port, would have suffered exactly the same fate. Both men are looking at the same drawings. That is the honest state of the argument, and the argument has never closed. What the critics and the defenders agree on is the thing at the top of the ship. The foretop, which held the principal gunnery director, the eyes and the brain of 8 guns, stood behind walls of 60 millimeters with a roof of 20, about 2.5 inches. Her belt was more than 5 times thicker than the box holding the men who aimed her. There was a heavily armoured conning tower below it, with sides of 350 millimeters, and Okun's flat remark about that is the sharpest sentence written on the subject. It does not matter how much armour a conning tower has if the conning personnel are not in it. Gasquet and Dulin put the verdict plainly. The ship was extremely vulnerable to long-range plunging shellfire, with armour optimised for close-range gunnery actions, which is to say, for the war before this one. Okun's judgment of the whole national school is harsher still, that Germany seems to have been the most reactionary of all nations in its large warship designs. Even her layout looked backwards. 4 twin turrets in a line at a time when other navies were putting 3 guns in a single house, and the family tree is itself disputed. Some historians calling her and Tirpitz copies of the Baden and Bayern of the First World War, while Rico insists the design had nothing to do with those ships, and looked instead like an enlarged Scharnhorst. And there is a colder line in the same literature. Almost all the German survivors came from battle stations below the armour deck. The armour did its work. It did it for the men in the boiler rooms. Now go aft, below the waterline, into a part of the ship no visitor ever saw and no photograph ever made famous. She was driven by 3 shafts rather than 4, a choice made to save weight, turning 3 propellers of 4.7 meters at 270 revolutions a minute. Behind them, or rather beside them, were her 2 rudders, each a little over 24 square meters, canted 8 degrees. They did not sit behind the propellers, where the wash of the screws would drive across them and give a helmsman something to bite on. They sat midway between the centre line and the wing propellers, in clear water. That arrangement had consequences on paper long before it had any at sea. Gasquet and Dulin calculate that the 3-screw layout cost her about 1/3 of the turning power a 4-shaft ship of her size would have had. The German engineering texts of the day did list a tighter turning circle among the advantages of 3-screw ships, and the German engineering texts of the day were describing ships with the rudder positioned amidships in the stream of the centre screw. Bismarck had 2 rudders between the shafts instead, and as Schulze Hinrichs noted afterwards, nothing is known of corresponding trials. Nobody had tested the combination. The heavy cruiser that would one day sail beside her into the Atlantic, Prince Eugen, had 3 shafts as well. Where the rudders met the ship, there was one further peculiarity. the steering complex itself sat inside a box of 150mm armour, thick enough to shrug off a great deal, and immediately aft of that box, the hull tapered away into a stern overhang about 10 metres long, narrow and light, shaped like the back of a canoe. Armour, then a joint, then almost nothing. Inside the ship, the rudders were worked by push-button from 3 separate helm stations, an idea thought clever at the time, and one the German Navy of today has abandoned altogether after a study of how people actually behave under pressure. One man inside the design was uneasy, and what he was uneasy about was the armour. Marineborat Heinrich Schlüter, one of her own constructors, thought the lower edge of the side belt should have been carried further down, further below the design waterline than the final drawings allowed, so that a blow arriving beneath the wall would still find steel in its way. He appears to have made no formal fight of it. What survives is smaller and sadder than a memorandum. He told his wife, at home, before he left. Then he packed his bag and went aboard the ship he had helped to draw, and sailed in her. By the late summer of 1940, she was very nearly a warship. She needed a crew, and she needed a captain, and the Navy gave her a man who had never in his life had a ship. Chapter 3. A captain who had never had a ship. Germany's leading gunnery expert took command of the largest warship in the fleet without ever having commanded a ship at all. Ernst Lindemann was 46 years old, born on the 28th of March 1894, a Capitaine zur See since 1938, and in 1940 he stood second out of his entire year of naval cadets, the class of 1913. His career had been spent inside the science of naval gunnery, the mathematics of throwing a shell at a moving object from a moving platform across 10 miles of moving water. He had never held a shipboard command, a situation rare in the Kriegsmarine and possibly unique in it. The best gunman in the Navy was handed the best gun platform in the Navy, and the arrangement made a certain hard sense. She was commissioned on a Saturday, the 24th of August, 1940, with the yardmen who had built her drawn up to hear the new captain speak. He told them that from that day forth, she was the largest, strongest, and best battleship that has ever been launched by any German or foreign shipyard. It was a yard speech, and the pride in it belonged to them as much as to him, and it ended the way such speeches ended in that country in that year, with an oath of obedience to the Führer and a shouted salute. He also settled a small matter of language, and it says more about him than the speech does. Sailors call a ship she. Lindemann ordered that this one be called he, on the grounds that she was too powerful to be a woman. His officers obeyed him. Almost nobody since ever has. Among the officers who came to her that year was the man on whom, without any of them knowing it, this entire story would come to rest. Kapitän-Leutnant Baron Burkhard von Müllenheim-Rechberg was 30, born on the 25th of June 1910, and from the autumn of 1938 he had served as assistant naval attaché in London, which meant that he spoke English well enough to argue in it. He came down to see her that June and remembered exactly what he found. A dusty steel giant made fast to a wharf and littered with tools, welding equipment and cables. His own memoir and the standard reference call him the 4th gunnery officer. The contemporary British file that recorded his interrogation calls him the 3rd. The dispute is small, and it stays in the record, because almost everything the world knows about the inside of this ship comes through him. Her crew came from everywhere a navy finds men, and one draft arrived carrying a history. About 600 survivors of the cruiser Karlsruhe joined her on the 22nd of April, 1940. Among them was Maschinenmat Heinrich Kundt, a machinist's mate who walked aboard the new battleship on his own 23rd birthday, having been born on the 22nd of April, 1917. 600 men who had already had one ship go down beneath them were given the newest and strongest hull in the fleet, which must have felt, at the time, like the Navy making amends. Making her ready took months of unglamorous work. She went into dry dock from the 23rd of June to the 14th of July 1940 to have her propellers fitted and her hull degaussed against magnetic mines. On the 21st of July, they inclined her, rolling her deliberately in still water to measure her stability at a weight of 42,500 tons. Then came trials, and trials meant going out into the Baltic in the autumn of 1940 and finding out what did not work. A great deal did not work, in the way a great deal always does not work in a new ship. She left Hamburg for working up on the 15th of September 1940 and collided with a tug on the first evening, harmlessly. That same night, her anti-aircraft gunners fired more than 300 rounds into the dark and hit nothing at all. Part of the failure was built into her. Her 16 heavy anti-aircraft guns came in 2 different mount types with different training and elevating characteristics, which her fire control apparently did not account for, and her 16 light guns of 3.7 centimeters were hand-loaded, hand-trained, and under no director control whatever, managing about 30 rounds a minute where the book promised 80. A battleship of that size is a collection of separate machines that have to be taught, slowly, to agree with one another. The heart of her worked magnificently. 12 Wagner boilers raised steam at 450 degrees and fed 3 geared turbine sets. And she had no cruising turbine, so she burned oil at a rate that suited a fast ship and punished a patient one. She was designed for 138,000 horsepower and 29 knots. On the measured mile, on the 23rd of October 1940, she made 150,170 horsepower and 30.1 knots. She carried 8,294 tons of oil, of which only about 7,400 could be pumped, so that 900 tons of her own fuel lay in her bottom beyond the reach of her own pumps. Her range is given as 8,525 miles at 19 knots by one authority and 9,500 by another, and the figure most often quoted in English belongs to her sister Tirpitz and was never hers at all. There is one machinery fact about her that reads like bad luck. Her constructors had wanted turbo-electric drive, and Raeder had ordered it, and Siemens Schuckert withdrew from the work less than a month before construction on her began. So she went to sea with steam and geared turbines and 3 shafts, and the shafts were the arrangement she would live with. Then came the ordinary misfortunes of a new ship, one after another. On the morning of the 8th of March 1941, at 8:45, she ran aground in the Kiel Canal, a waterway 98 kilometers long, opened in 1895, whose depth had already helped to set the ceiling on how large she could be built in the first place. 4 days later, at 4:05 on the morning of the 12th of March, a British air raid found her in her floating dock. The dock was lowered 6 meters, a boiler room flooded, and her people pumped it out in 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Damage control aboard that ship was very good indeed, and every man aboard knew it. The Naval Acceptance Command lived aboard from the 29th of January to the 2nd of April 1941 and filed report number 700. And on the 28th of April, Lindemann wrote up the whole working up in his war diary in the tone of a man who has finished a long job well. Readiness had been reached after 8 months, over the target date by only 14 days. The standard of training, he thought, was comparable to a capital ship's readiness for a full battle inspection in the good years of peacetime. He noted, honestly, that the crew completely lacks real combat experience, and then he set down the sentence that is the true German claim about this ship, made privately in a log by the man who knew her best. For the first time in years, he wrote, the Navy had a ship whose fighting qualities are at least a match for any enemy. One finding never made it into that diary. Back in November of 1940, out on trials, they had run her hard, and she had made 30.8 knots, and somebody had taken the sensible precaution of finding out what she could do if her rudders were unavailable to her. The answer sits in a single sentence in the German literature. Without using the rudders, but only the screw propellers, Bismarck was almost impossible to steer. Müllenheim-Rechberg later put it just as plainly that the problem had already been revealed during sea trials and could not be corrected. The trial was run, the result was written down, the file was closed, and nothing whatever was done about it. 6 months later, the admiral who would take her into the Atlantic was telling a friend that he did not expect to come back. Chapter 4. The admiral who had already decided. Before the operation began, the man commanding it told a friend that he expected to die on it. Konteradmiral Konrad Patzig, who knew him well, told him not to go. Günther Lütjens answered in sentences with the flatness of a man reading a column of figures. Given the uneven relation of forces, he said, he was of the opinion that he should have to sacrifice himself sooner or later. He had closed out his private life. He was determined to carry out the assignment given to him honourably, one way or another. Minutes later, speaking to Vice-Admiral Voss, he said that survival was improbable. Nothing in his record suggests a man given to theatre. He was 51 years old, born on the 25th of May, 1889, promoted admiral on the 1st of September 1940, and fleet chief from the 8th of July of that year. Between the 28th of December 1940 and the 22nd of March 1941, he had taken Scharnhorst and Gneisenau out into the Atlantic on Operation Berlin and stayed out there for 59 days, covering 17,800 nautical miles, not far short of a voyage round the world, and sinking or capturing 22 merchant ships of 116,000 tons. Roughly one ship every 3 days, lifted out of the sea lanes by 2 fast capital ships the Royal Navy could not find. That was the model. That was what a raiding cruise was supposed to look like. Which is why the mood he carried into the spring of 1941 matters. He had told Raeder what he thought of the way the heavy ships were being spent, that the fleet should not be fed into the battle teaspoon by teaspoon. It is a domestic image, small and exact, and it describes precisely what Germany had been doing, sending its capital ships out 1 and 2 at a time against a navy that could concentrate. A man who says that to his commander-in-chief has done the arithmetic of his own war and reached an answer he does not like. The navy he was arguing with had been built for a war that was still 9 years off when the shooting started. Plan Z, approved on the 27th of January 1939, 18 days before Bismarck went into the water, promised 10 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, and 249 submarines, the whole fleet complete by 1948. Bismarck was ordered in 1935 and laid down in 1936, so she was never a product of that plan. She was the ship that made the plan look plausible. The war came in 1939 instead, and what Germany had at sea to fight it with was a handful of very fast ships, each of which could be sunk exactly once. The orders he sailed under said, in writing, that he was to avoid a fight. The directive went out on the 2nd of April 1941. The same day, Bismarck took aboard the last 2 of her Arado floatplanes. Raeder's wording is the most important paragraph in this whole story. The objective of the Bismarck, it reads, was to tie down enemies of equal strength in a delaying action while preserving her combat capacity as much as possible, rather than to defeat them. The primary target in this operation is the enemy's merchant shipping. Enemy warships will be engaged only when that objective makes it necessary, and it can be done without excessive risk. Read that again with the ship in mind. The most powerful gun platform Germany ever built was going to sea to sink freighters and to run from anything that could shoot back at her. The whole idea was to make the Atlantic unusable, to force the Royal Navy to escort every convoy with a capital ship, and so to stretch it until it tore. She was a weapon aimed at cargo and at the nerve of the men who had to move it. She was fitted for exactly that work. 4 Arado float planes rode in her hangars, out of a capacity of 6, to be flung off a catapult 32 meters long that could be run out to 48, so that she could look over a horizon she had not yet reached and find the smoke of a convoy without spending a day of steaming to go and look. The plan that Raeder's directive was written for had 4 capital ships in it. Bismarck, Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, and Gneisenau were to go into the Atlantic together and take the convoy routes apart. That force never existed outside the paper. Scharnhorst was in dock with her boilers coming out after metallurgical trouble on the last cruise, unavailable at least until June. Tirpitz had been commissioned only on the 25th of February 1941, and her trials were nowhere near complete. Gneisenau had been torpedoed at Brest on the 6th of April by a Beaufort of No. 22 Squadron, flown by Flying Officer Kenneth Campbell, who was shot down and then hit again on the night of the 10th and 11th of April by 4 semi-armour piercing bombs of 500 pounds that killed 72 of her men. The estimate for her repair was at least 6 months. Even the escort suffered. Prince Eugen struck a mine on the 23rd of April and cost the operation another 2 weeks. So a sweep by 4 capital ships became 1 battleship and 1 heavy cruiser, and everybody involved could see the arithmetic. The margin the plan had been built on was gone. The operation kept its name, kept its orders, and went ahead on schedule. Lütjens said so to the one man who could have stopped it. He had been in Paris on the 8th of April, arranging support from Dönitz and the submarines. On the 26th of April, in Berlin, he suggested to Raeder that the operation be postponed until Scharnhorst or Tirpitz, or both, were ready to sail with her. The Grand Admiral thought it imperative to resume the Battle of the Atlantic as soon as possible, and ordered the operation to go forward. He was, in one historian's phrase, simply not willing to postpone the venture any longer. Why he was in such a hurry is a question the historians answer differently, and the documents do not settle it. One reading has him defending the budget of a capital ship navy against an army about to swallow the whole German war effort in the East. Another has him doing exactly what he said he was doing, keeping the pressure on the convoy routes at the moment the submarine campaign was biting. The sortie sailed either way, and the man who had asked for it to wait was the man ordered to lead it. On the 5th of May, Hitler came to Gotenhafen to see her. Lutjens received him aboard and walked him round the ship and said nothing whatever about the operation that was less than a fortnight away. The head of state left the largest warship in his navy without being told that she was about to go into the Atlantic. Then the small mechanical business of getting a ship to sea. Lütjens and his fleet staff embarked on the 13th of May. On the 14th, her 12-ton port-side crane broke and put the departure back. On the 16th, the date was fixed for the 18th. Stores began to come up the Brows, food and spare parts and ammunition for 3 months at sea for more than 2,000 men, in the quantities a floating town consumes. All of it swung aboard and struck down into a hull that had been afloat for 2 years and had never yet been shot at. The men came aboard with the stores. Her designed complement was 2,065, and for this sortie she carried 2,221, a figure the British interrogation file and the American Naval Intelligence Office record differently, and which one of her own survivors remembered afterwards as almost 2,400. Among them was a prize crew of about 80. A prize crew exists for one purpose: to board a captured merchant ship, take charge of her, and sail her into a friendly port, and those 80 men had no battle stations aboard Bismarck. Nobody had allotted them any. In the operation as written, they were never going to be aboard for a battle at all. And on the 18th of May, at Gotenhafen, they began to put the fuel aboard her. Chapter 5. She sailed 200 tons short. A fuel hose broke while she was loading, and nobody ordered it made good before she weighed anchor. It happened at Gotenhafen on the 18th of May, in the last hours before the largest battleship in commission with any navy went to war. Oil came out of the broken line and spread across her plating, and the mess had to be cleaned before the pumping could begin again, and by the time it was clean, there was no longer enough time to finish. A second worry pressed on the officer with the clipboard, and it was a grim one. Several Polish labourers had died cleaning her oil tanks, and the fear of fumes sat in everyone's mind. So the hose stayed broken, the fueling stopped where it stood, and the ship went out to the war with roughly 200 tons less oil than her bunkers were built to hold. Two accounts, working independently of each other, arrive at the same figure, and neither of them treats it as a catastrophe. José Rico calls it nothing significant. Judged on what any man aboard could see that morning, it was nothing significant. Her bunkerage was 8,294 tons, of which about 7,400 could actually be drawn out of the tanks and burned. 200 tons set against 7,400 comes to 1 part in 37. It is a car leaving the drive with the needle a hair below the top of the gauge. No navy on earth holds a battle fleet in harbour for that. At 10 that morning, the Admiral had come aboard and conferred with Lindemann and with Brinkmann of the Prince Eugen, and the three of them settled the shape of the passage. Weather permitting, they would leave the Course Fjord alone entirely. They would run past Norway and refuel at sea from the tanker Weissenburg, out in the wide, empty water where nobody was watching. At noon, the Bismarck let go and left the berth with the fleet band playing Muss i den, and the operation the German Navy called Rheinübung began. She began it alone, in the sense that mattered. The plan had once been drawn for 4 capital ships, and 4 capital ships had been the whole point of it. The Scharnhorst sat in dock, with her boilers waiting to be retubed after metallurgical trouble in the Atlantic, and would not be available until June at the earliest. The Tirpitz, her own sister, had been in commission for less than 3 months, and her trials were nowhere near complete. The Gneisenau had been torpedoed on the 6th of April by a Beaufort of 22 Squadron, flown by an officer named Kenneth Campbell, who was shot down doing it, and then hit again on the night of the 10th and 11th of April by 4 bombs that killed 72 of her men, and the estimate for repairing her ran to at least 6 months. Even the Prince Eugen had struck a mine on the 23rd of April and lost a fortnight to it. 1 battleship and 1 heavy cruiser were about to attempt the work of 4. The man leading them had said so out loud, to the only man who could have stopped it. In Berlin, on the 26th of April, Lütjens put it to Raeder that the operation might be postponed until the Scharnhorst or the Tirpitz was ready. Raeder judged it imperative to resume the Battle of the Atlantic as soon as possible, and ordered the operation forward. The Hood Association records the same refusal in plainer words, that the Grand Admiral was simply not willing to postpone the venture any longer. Why he was unwilling is argued over to this day, and the argument is interpretation rather than record. The Prince Eugen slipped shortly after 9 that evening. The Bismarck followed at 2 in the morning on the 19th of May, in the dark, in the way that great secret things always leave harbour, with the yard lights behind her and the Baltic black ahead. 2,221 men were aboard her by the fleet's own count, though the records differ, and one survivor later put it at almost 2,400. Among them was a prize crew of about 80, embarked to sail captured merchant ships home, who had no battle stations at all. Not one man aboard had ever been in action in her. A warship leaving harbour in the dark makes very little of it. The tugs stand off, the wake widens, the lights of the port slide astern and go out one at a time, and the water ahead has no edges in it at all. She went down the Baltic that night at the head of her own long white furrow, and the men not on watch turned in. On the charts in her plotting room lay the whole North Atlantic, the convoy routes that fed Britain, and the narrow gap between Greenland and Iceland that she would have to pass through to reach them. Nobody aboard her was thinking about a fuel hose. They met off Rügen at 25 minutes past 11 that morning, battleship and cruiser closing on one another across a grey sea, and formed up with their escorts. Destroyers took station on the flanks of something that made them look like toys, the Friedrich Eckelt among them, with the Hans Lodi joining at 10:30 that night. The Bismarck was 251 metres long, 823 feet and 6 inches from stem to stern. More than 9/10 of her was welded rather than riveted. She was divided into 22 watertight sections, 17 of them inside an armoured citadel that ran 170 metres, covering 7/10 of her waterline, which José Rico calls by far the greatest extent of any modern battleship. She carried 8 guns of 38 centimetres and 1,004 rounds for them. Her armament told 2 stories at once. The main battery threw an 800-kilogram shell at 820 metres a second to a range of 35.5 kilometres, which is to say she could put a shell the weight of a small car onto a target 22 miles away and hope to hit it. Against aircraft, she carried 16 heavy guns in 2 different kinds of mounting, which trained and elevated differently in ways her fire control system had apparently never been set up to allow for. 16 lighter guns that were loaded by hand and trained by hand and worked under no director control at all, managing about 30 rounds a minute against a nominal 80 and 20 barrels of the smallest calibre she carried. The guns that pointed outwards were among the finest in any fleet. The guns that pointed upwards had never been made to work as one system. Then the loudspeakers came on, and Lindemann told his crew where they were going. They were bound for the North Atlantic, he said, for a period of several months. It is a sentence with a lot inside it. Several months meant no port, no letters, no relief, no return until the work was done. It also meant that every man listening now understood that the thing they had been drilling for since the previous September was no longer a drill. Then the Admiral spoke and gave the operation the phrase it would be remembered by. Their objective, he told them, was commerce raiding in the Atlantic, imperiling England's existence. And then, in the words the operation itself chose, he gave them the hunter's toast. Good hunting, and a good bag. It is the language of the shooting party, and it was chosen with care because it described the job exactly. Raiders' written orders for Rheinübung say so without any decoration at all. The objective of the Bismarck was to tie enemies of equal strength down in a delaying action while preserving her combat capacity as much as possible, and defeating them formed no part of the task. The primary target in this operation was the enemy's merchant shipping, with enemy warships to be engaged only when that objective made it necessary, and it could be done without excessive risk. The most powerful gun platform Germany ever built had gone to sea to sink cargo ships. Every man aboard had just been told so over the tannoy. Aboard, the mood was high, and the paperwork supports it. Lindemann had written in his war diary at the end of April that the ship's working up had been completed in 8 months, over the target date by only 14 days, and that her training compared with a capital ship's readiness for a full-scale battle inspection in the good years of peacetime. He conceded in the same entry that the crew completely lacked real combat experience, and he set down beside that concession his calm feeling that all forthcoming combat demands would be readily dealt with. She was provisioned for 3 months. She was, on paper, and in the opinion of the man who commanded her, ready, and she was 200 tons short. This is the moment to hold that number still, because nobody aboard was holding it. 200 tons of fuel oil is roughly 200 cubic meters of thick black liquid, a volume that would fill a modest suburban house from floor to ceiling. On the morning of the 19th of May, it was an accounting note. 5 days later, it would sit at the center of every decision her admiral made, and it would matter for a reason that had nothing to do with how much was in her tanks. That reason was still 5 days and 1 battle away, and no one on that ship could possibly have seen it coming. They went through the Great Belt overnight, feeling their way down the Danish Narrows in the dark, with the escorts sweeping ahead, and came out into the Kattegat on the morning of the 20th. This was the last stretch of enclosed water before the North Sea, and it was thick with mines. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the 5th mine-sweeping flotilla came out to shepherd them through the fields off Skagen, and while they worked their way north, 3 mines went up somewhere astern of the sweep gear, 3 flat concussions rolling across a calm sea. The flotilla was dismissed at 13 minutes past 4, its job done, and the 2 big ships ran on alone. Half an hour before the sweepers arrived, at 1 o'clock exactly, a warship neither German nor British came over the horizon on a course of her own, in daylight, at close range, and looked straight at them. Chapter 6. Photographed at anchor, before she had done anything. The largest naval hunt in history began while she was still lying at anchor in a Norwegian fjord. The ship that started it was the Swedish cruiser Gotland, neutral, unhurried, going about her own business in the Kattegat under Captain Knut Ogren, and at 1 in the afternoon on the 20th of May, she found herself watching the German fleet go by. 2 large warships, a screen of destroyers, aircraft overhead. There was nothing to be done about it. A neutral cruiser in a neutral sea has every right to be there, and the men on the Bismarck's bridge could only stand and be looked at. Lütjens understood exactly what had happened. He did not wait to find out whether the Swedes would talk. He assumed at once that he had been reported and signalled Group North to that effect the same day, which is the act of a careful commander, and also the act of a man who now knew that the element of surprise on which the entire operation rested had been damaged before he had even cleared home waters. He knew, and he pressed on. He was right to assume it. The sighting travelled to Stockholm, and in Stockholm it reached Captain Henry Denham, and Denham put it on the wire to London that evening. His signal survives word for word, and it is a small masterpiece of the form, cold and exact and utterly devastating. Kattegat, today, the 20th of May. At 1500, 2 large warships, escorted by 3 destroyers, 5 ships, and 10 or 12 planes, passed Marstrand to the northeast. It is 30-odd words. It is the beginning of the end of the Bismarck. Then it happened again. At dusk, as the squadron came up past Kristiansand on the Norwegian coast, a man named Viggo Axelsen of the Norwegian resistance watched them pass and got the word out. It went to London through the secret unregistered personal transmitter that Gunvald Tomstad kept at Flekkefjord, an illegal set in an occupied country, tapping out the position of the newest battleship in the world. 2 men and a hidden wireless. So by the evening of the 20th of May, the Admiralty held a Swedish sighting, a Norwegian report, and a course. The Bismarck had not yet seen a British ship. She had not fired a gun, sunk a merchantman, or done one single thing that the operation existed to do. And in London, on a plotting table, the arrow was already drawn. She spent the next day at rest. The weather on the 21st was too clear for Lutjens to run straight past Norway as he had intended, so at about 9 in the morning, the squadron turned into the Korsfjord, and at noon, the Bismarck let go her anchor in the Grimstad Fjord, between 250 and 500 metres off the shore, under high green rock. The Prince Eugen went to Kalvanes Bay and moored with 2 merchant ships alongside her as torpedo shields. 950 miles of the voyage were behind them. Hands went over the side and along the decks to paint out the camouflage she had worn through the Baltic and to cover the swastikas painted on her upper decks. And for a few hours, a battleship at anchor in a Norwegian fjord looked like the most peaceful object in Europe. Coastal Command had sent 2 Spitfires from Scotland at 11 that morning. At 1:15 in the afternoon, one of them was over the fjords at 8,000 metres, which is 26,200 feet, 5 miles straight up, so high that the pilot could see the curve of the coast, and nothing on the water could see or hear him at all. His name was Flying Officer Michael Suckling. He took his photographs and turned for home and landed at Wick at about 2:15, and when the plates came out of the tank, they showed 1 Bismarck-class battleship and 1 Hipper-class cruiser lying quietly at anchor. 1 aircraft, 1 man, 1 camera, 1 pass. The Bismarck had cost the German state 196,800,000 Reichsmarks, and every ton of her had been built to survive the guns of other battleships. What found her was a single camera aircraft flying too high to be heard, and a roll of film that came off it at Wick, in the north of Scotland. From the moment those plates came out dry, the Royal Navy no longer had to search the whole of the Northern Sea. It only had to guess which way she would go. That was the moment the machine began to turn. Admiral Tovey put the cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk, under Rear Admiral William Frederick Wake Walker, into the Denmark Strait to watch the northern door. And shortly before midnight, the Hood, flying the flag of Vice Admiral Lancelot Ernest Holland and commanded by Captain Ralph Kerr, together with the new battleship Prince of Wales under Captain John Leach and 6 destroyers, went out of Scapa Flow. The Association logs her anchor away at 4 minutes to midnight, and the Hoxha Gate cleared at 10 minutes to 1. Ted Briggs, who was aboard her and who would be one of 3 men to live through what came next, remembered it simply as sailing at midnight. The arrangement of that day deserves setting down plainly. On one side of the North Sea, a battleship swung gently on her cable in flat water, while men on stages painted her sides and the galley served dinner. On the other, an admiral in Scapa Flow read a photograph, and the Hood went out through the boom to meet her. She was nearly 12 metres longer than the ship the newspapers would shortly be calling the largest afloat. The Prince of Wales beside her was so new that her builders were still aboard. The Bismarck had been at sea for 2 days. She had not seen a British ship, fired a gun in anger, or sunk anything at all, and she was already being hunted by both of them. And in the middle of that quiet day at anchor, the decision was taken that the whole story turns on. There was a tanker in the fjord system, the Volin, and the Prince Eugen used her. The cruiser had less than 2,500 tons of fuel oil left in her tanks, which for a ship of her size is thin, and she took what she needed and had finished by 5 in the afternoon. The Bismarck lay a few miles away and took nothing. Garsger and Dulin, who spent their professional lives on the technical history of these ships and who name the tanker as the Wallin, call it an inexplicable oversight for an experienced commander such as Admiral Lütjens. They are scrupulous about the case for the defence. His orders did not require him to top up, because a rendezvous with the Weissenberg was already planned out in the Atlantic. The tanker in the fjord may not have had enough to give him. Part of his crew was busy painting out the camouflage, and having laid all that out fairly, they land on the verdict anyway. Whatever the reason, the failure to top off the Bismarck's tanks was to prove to be a crucial omission. The Hood Association says the same thing more briefly, that for reasons unknown she did not refuel, and that the decision would later prove to have fatal consequences. No document records what Lutjens was thinking. Not a log entry, not a signal, not a remembered remark. The most consequential non-decision of the operation is a blank space in the record, and every explanation offered for it since has been somebody's guess. Here is the part that gets left out. She was in no danger. The International Naval Research Organization states it flatly and in capital letters that contrary to what has been established about the fuel situation on the Bismarck, she was never in danger of actually running out of fuel. Not on the 21st of May, and not afterwards. The 200 tons and the declined top-up did not empty her. What they did was to fix in one man's head a picture of a ship that was emptying, and from the morning of the 24th of May onwards, that picture would govern the movements of the most powerful warship in the world. The tanks were fine. The Admiral was not. The last warning came in at 7:30 that evening, as the anchors came up. The ship's radio intelligence section handed the bridge a signal relayed from Germany. British aircraft, on an intercepted transmission, had been told to look out for 2 battleships and 3 destroyers steering north. The Germans now knew that the British knew, and they knew what the British were looking for, and they knew roughly where the British expected to find it. They sailed anyway. The ships left the fjords at about 8 in the evening on the 21st of May, and at 20 minutes to midnight, they came round onto a course of due north and began to climb the map towards the ice. Behind them, the British spent a frustrating day. On the 22nd, 18 bombers went out from Wick to hit the anchorage, and only 2 of them found the target area at all, bombing blind through cloud at nothing. Nobody knew whether the Germans were still there. In the end, it took 1 unarmed target towing Maryland, flown by Lieutenant Noel Goddard with Geoffrey Rotherham as observer, taking off at 4:30 in the afternoon on the initiative of men who had simply decided to go and look. They flew low into the fjords, found empty water, and Rotherham carried the news back and reported in person just before 8 that evening. At 11:15, Tovey took the home fleet out of Scapa in the King George V, with the carrier Victorious, 4 cruisers and a screen of destroyers, and the battlecruiser Repulse came round from the Clyde to join him. Churchill signalled Roosevelt that a formidable Atlantic raid was intended, and asked for the news, and promised that the job would be finished. The fjords were empty because the Bismarck was already well north of them, dismissing her destroyers to Trondheim and working up to 24 knots, running for a stretch of water where the sea itself would do half the Royal Navy's work. Chapter 7. Ice on one side, mines on the other. She went north into the Denmark Strait, into a corridor of open water narrowing between the ice and a minefield. The Denmark Strait is the gap between Iceland and the east coast of Greenland, and in May it is one of the least forgiving pieces of ocean in the northern hemisphere. Pack ice comes down the Greenland side and squeezes the navigable channel from the west. From the east, the British had laid mines to squeeze it from the other side. What is left between the two is a lane, and the width of that lane on any given day depends on how far the ice has come down that week. A ship that wants to slip out of the Arctic into the Atlantic without being seen has to thread it, and a ship that wants to catch her has only to sit in it and wait. The Germans made their run for it in weather that seemed like a gift. The destroyers were sent away to Trondheim at 20 minutes past 4 in the morning on the 22nd, and after that it was 2 ships alone at 24 knots. An alarm at 23 minutes to 1 sent them zigzagging for half an hour over nothing. Then they turned northwest into fog, and the fog closed so thick around them that a battleship and a heavy cruiser in close company had to burn searchlights to keep station on each other. For a commerce raider trying to reach the Atlantic unseen, fog is the best news in the world. The trouble was that the British had already worked out where the lane was. The primary document is the report of Captain Ellis of the Suffolk, and it reads like a survey. He parted company from the Norfolk at 11 in the morning on the 23rd and ran up to the ice, meeting the main edge at 25 minutes past 2 in the afternoon at 66 degrees, 50 minutes north, 25 degrees, 34 minutes west. He then traced that edge northeast along a line of fixes and noted where it ran clear of the mines. His own footnote explains why the question was live. On the 13th of May, the ice had drifted right over most of that minefield and torn a great many mines loose, and more than 70 of them had been counted floating away eastwards in the days that followed. The gap between the ice and the mines was narrow. It moved, and the Royal Navy knew where it was. At 10 minutes past 6 that evening, the Suffolk steadied on a course of 240 at 18 knots and set herself up like a trap. Her radar sweep was adjusted to cover the bearings that mattered in a visibility of under 8 miles. Her longer ranged set was kept on listening watch and deliberately not used for transmitting, because a transmitting set can be heard. She ran along the edge of the ice with the mist on her beam, ready to duck into it, waiting for something to come down the lane. At 22 minutes past 7 in the evening on the 23rd of May, able seaman Alfred Newell, the starboard after lookout, was covering the blind zone astern that the radar could not see into. He called out that there was a ship bearing green 140. A moment later he corrected himself. 2 ships bearing green 140. The Suffolk's official report puts it down in the flat language of a log. Sighted Bismarck, followed by a large cruiser, bearing 020, 7 miles, course 240. 7 miles is nothing. At that range, on a clear patch of Arctic evening, the 2 forces were inside each other's gun range, and neither had known the other was there. The German account agrees to the minute. Their alarm sounded at 22 minutes past 7. By the time the turrets had trained, the Suffolk had put her helm over and vanished into the fog bank she had been shadowing along all evening. She had been visible for a matter of minutes, and in those minutes, the operation lost the last thing it had left, which was secrecy. The cruiser ran for cover and then began to work. At 7:30, she settled on a mean course of 210 to keep clear of another British minefield while staying inside the mist. And from that moment, she was a set of eyes reporting a plot. Her people had the enemy at 20 knots at first, rising to 28 within half an hour as the Germans opened out and ran. Somewhere to the south, a British admiral was reading those numbers off a signal pad and doing arithmetic. At 8:30, the Germans caught sight of the Norfolk coming up out of the murk, and the Bismarck opened fire immediately. 5 salvos went out, 3 of them straddled, which is to say the shells fell short and over and around the cruiser with the ship in the middle of the pattern, which is what gunnery officers spend their careers trying to achieve. The Norfolk put her helm hard over, made smoke, and got out of it unhurt. The Hood Association records the significance of it exactly. This was the first time the new German battleship had fired salvos in anger, and it served as a warning to the British of the deadly accuracy of the Bismarck's guns. It also blinded her. The blast of her own forward turrets firing over the bow put her forward radar set out of action, and this is where the shape of the disaster starts to show. Lutjens could not lead a chase through fog and snow with a dead set forward, so he ordered his 2 ships to change stations. The Prince Eugen, with her radar intact, took the lead. The Bismarck fell in astern. The change was sensible, immediate, and invisible to the Royal Navy, and José Rico's judgment on it is worth the exact words. This change would produce great confusion on the British the next morning. The technical picture behind that moment is the whole reason the next morning happened as it did. The Bismarck carried 3 SeaTac radar sets, reaching about 25,000 meters, with an accuracy of some 70 meters either way. They displayed on a simple line trace with no plan view at all. Rico is blunt about what that meant in practice. They could hardly detect more than one target at the same time, and bearings were not very accurate either. What actually carried her gunnery was glass. She had 5 Zeiss stereoscopic rangefinders of 10.5 meters base length, one of which had been taken out of Anton turret over the winter, and instruments of that quality could hold a target to within 40 or 50 meters at 20,000 meters. On a clear morning, her optics were the finest in the world, and her radar could barely count to 2. The British had the mirror image of that problem. The Suffolk set reached 13 miles and had a blind spot dead astern, which is why a man with binoculars was posted to cover it, and why a man with binoculars, and not a cathode ray tube, made the sighting that decided the campaign. The Norfolk carried an older set that could only see ahead. The 2 cruisers had been stationed by capability, the Suffolk on the Greenland side, where her better set could reach across the lane, the Norfolk to port. Between them, in the dark and in snow, they held on. Lutjens had turned back once before, when a British cruiser had found him. This time he pressed on. Rico's reading is that he probably believed the home fleet was too far away to matter, and might even still be lying in Scapa Flow. It was a reasonable belief. It was also, by that hour, badly out of date. The shadowing went on all night, and it very nearly failed. At around 10 in the evening, the Bismarck had reversed course to try to catch the cruiser following her, a battleship turning on her pursuer in fog, and had found nothing. The Suffolk lost contact at midnight in a snowstorm that held visibility down to about a mile until 3:15. Contact came back at 14 minutes to 3 at 19,200 yards, and at 21 minutes past 3, the Suffolk logged the enemy in sight again, bearing 185, 12 miles, course 240. The lifeline had frayed twice and held. 300 miles to the south, the other half of the trap was closing. At 21 minutes to 8 that evening, Vice Admiral Holland had raised steam and come round to 295. The Suffolk's sighting report reached him at 4 minutes past 8, and the Norfolk's at 20 minutes to 9. At 6 minutes to 9, he was making 27 knots, and he told his 6 destroyers that if they could not hold that speed, he would go on without them. At 10 o'clock, the crews were told what was coming and given a time, between 20 minutes to 2 and 2 in the morning. 2 things went wrong in those hours, and neither of them looked like much. At midnight, Holland made a signal setting out his plan, that both his ships would engage the Bismarck and leave the Prince Eugen to the Norfolk and the Suffolk. Because he was keeping radio silence, it was never transmitted. Neither cruiser ever learned what part it was expected to play. And aboard the Prince of Wales, Captain Leach found his main gunnery radar defective and asked permission to use his more powerful set instead. Permission was refused, because its transmissions would have interfered badly with the Hood's own gunnery radar. The better set stayed silent. The ship carrying it was not ready to fight anybody. The Prince of Wales had been completed at the end of March and never properly shaken down. Her crew was inexperienced. There were still shipyard workers aboard her, civilian technicians who had come to see because her main turrets did not work reliably. Gasquet and Dulin describe her in one line as a brand new ship with a partially trained crew and unreliable main battery turrets, and she was about to be sent into a gun action against the newest battleship in the world. At midnight, Holland went to action stations. The Hood raised a single battle ensign and steadied on her course, 120 miles south of the enemy, and closing at a combined speed that ate the distance faster than a man could sleep. At 3 minutes past 2, he turned to 200 at 25 knots and detached his destroyers northwards, spread at 15-mile intervals, to search. It was a sound decision, and it meant that when the shooting started, there would be no destroyers anywhere near the Hood. Somewhere out in that black water, on converging courses, 4 warships were running towards a single point they would all reach at the same moment, and every man in all 4 of them was awake. Chapter 8. 8 minutes in the Denmark Strait. At 8 minutes to 6 in the morning, the Hood opened fire on the wrong ship, and 8 minutes later, she no longer existed. Both fleets kept the same clock. German summertime was identical that month to British double summertime, so the German log and the British log tell the same story on the same minutes. At 13 minutes to 3 that morning, the Suffolk regained contact about 35 miles to the northwest. Holland turned onto 220, worked up to 28 knots, and at 19 minutes to 4, steadied both his ships on 240. Between 5 and 10 past 5, the order went round to prepare for instant action. At 7 minutes past 5, the Bismarck heard them. Her underwater microphones reached out between 26 and 40 kilometers, and what came in over them was the beat of heavy screws. The Germans logged the contact and judged it cruisers, which was reasonable and entirely wrong. At 25 minutes to 6, the Prince of Wales sighted smoke and mast tops at least 38,000 yards, better than 21 land miles. At 23 minutes to 6, the enemy report went out. 1 battleship and 1 heavy cruiser, bearing 335, distance 17 miles. In the same minute, Holland turned both ships 40 degrees to starboard together and pushed them to about 29 knots, the Prince of Wales holding some 800 yards off the Hood's starboard quarter. He was going in bows on, and it cost him half his guns. That angle masked the after turrets of both British ships, so that, on Barnett's reckoning, only 10 of 18 British heavy guns could train. He did it on purpose. The Hood's protection was known to be poor by modern standards, and against German 15-inch guns, she had effectively no immunity zone. Closing fast, flattened the trajectory of incoming shells and threw them against her side armour instead of her deck. Briggs confirmed the bridge understood the logic exactly. Tovey had considered ordering the better protected Prince of Wales to lead, and had decided against interfering with so senior an officer. At 17 minutes to 6, the Hood transmitted her own report, and the Germans intercepted it. At 5:45, the alarm went in both German ships. At 11 minutes to 6, Holland turned a further 20 degrees towards. At 10 minutes to 6, he made the signal that would haunt the inquiry. Both ships were to engage the left-hand German, presumed to be the Bismarck. It was the Prince Eugen. The mistake was reasonable. The battleship was expected to lead. The station swap of the previous evening was unknown, and the 2 Germans were only 1.5 to 2.5 kilometers apart, close enough to make the smaller ship look like the larger. Colin McMullen, gunnery officer of the Prince of Wales, spotted the error, and Holland amended the order moments before opening fire. The Hood's guns stayed on the left-hand ship, and why has never been established. Her own survivors were sure she fired 2 salvos before the correction came, and Captain Leach insisted it came first. The bleakest reading is her association's own. She shot most of her salvos between the 2 German ships and struck neither. At 8 minutes to 6, the Hood opened fire, forward turrets only, at about 25,000 yards. The Prince of Wales followed 30 seconds later. At 5 minutes to 6, the Prince Eugen fired, and then the Bismarck, and both concentrated on the hood. In the same minute, Holland hoisted the signal for a 20-degree turn to port to open his arcs and bring his after-turrets in at last. And in that same minute, aboard the Bismarck, the most famous exchange in the story went down a telephone. The British had been shooting for 2 minutes. Lutjens, under written orders to avoid warships wherever possible, had still not granted permission to reply. His first gunnery officer, Adalbert Schneider, called the bridge again. Lindemann answered and refused in the plainest words available to a German naval officer to have his ship shot out from under him, and gave permission to open fire. The verdict on that sentence needs care. It is documented, and it is second-hand. The most quoted line of the whole Bismarck story reaches the record through a survivor who overheard the call and comes down through Müllenheim-Rechberg, who published it 39 years later and who was 300 feet aft at the time, listening on an intercom. The Bismarck's first 4-gun salvo fell ahead of the Hood. The second landed between the 2 British ships. The third straddled, and the Prince Eugen straddled at almost the same moment, and something came down near the base of the Hood's mainmast and set the ready service lockers on the port shelter deck alight. Most of the evidence points at the Prince Eugen's 8-inch on eyewitness grounds, and because a 15-inch shell would likely have caused far more damage. Against that stands the awkward fact that her own gunnery officer said afterwards that her target was the Hood, when she had been ordered to shoot at the Prince of Wales. Bob Tilburn stood in the middle of it. A fire started, he told the board. A very fierce blaze, pinkish in colour, with not much smoke. His own guess was that the rocket ammunition had caught, and then the detail that mattered most. It did not seem to spread at all. The rounds cooking off were fairly small explosions, rather like a big Chinese cracker. From the Prince of Wales, Lieutenant Esmond Knight saw something else entirely. A blaze spreading very rapidly over the whole boat deck, high-licking red flames and dense pitch-black smoke. The order from the bridge, which the board recorded as Holland's own, was to leave it until the ammunition had gone. At 6:01, the Hood began her second turn to port. She was hit while she was turning. The Suffolk's log records what followed in 3 words. Hood blew up. The Admiralty's own board reconstructed the shooting afterwards. Third salvo, a straddle including at least 1 hit which burst on the port side just before the mainmast. Fourth, probably just over. Then the 5th undoubtedly straddled and hit, and the Hood blew up at a gun range of 16,500 yards. A second board hedged to the 5th or 6th. One correction travels with the phrase, since these were half salvos of 4 guns, so the fatal 5th salvo was 4 shells. Leach saw a salvo fall across the ship somewhere about the mainmast, and then, between 1 and 2 seconds after he formed that impression, an explosion took place in the Hood. There was a very fierce upward rush of flame the shape of a funnel, rather a thin funnel, and almost instantaneously the ship was enveloped in smoke from one end to the other. Knight said she exploded from absolutely amidships, that an enormous piece of wreckage flew 300 or 400 feet into the air, and that it was definitely an explosion from below. The board put the column at between 300 and 600 feet, a column of smoke and debris standing out of the Arctic taller than most cathedral spires. The strangest thing about it was the quiet. About 112 tons of cordite went up in her aftermagazine, more than 200 times the half-ton that peacetime experiment had ever burned, and the men closest to it heard almost nothing. Tilburn said it was just the same as if the guns had fired. Briggs said it was not a terrific explosion at all as regards noise. The gunnery officer of the Prince of Wales could recall no noise from it at all. She heeled to starboard, righted, and then began a roll to port from which she never recovered. Everything from just before the mainmast aft to the after turret was laid waste. The stern twisted, swung vertical and sank quickly. The forepart rose into the air at an angle somewhere between 45 degrees and straight up. One turret was blown clean overboard, and rivets from her plating fell on the Prince of Wales almost half a mile away. From the hit to the end was just under 3 minutes. The German report of a defiant last salvo from her forward turret is contested, and if it happened at all, it was likely a short circuit, a mechanical failure, or venting flame. No order to abandon ship was ever given. Holland sat in his seat and did not move. 3 men came out of 1,418. Midshipman William Dundas kicked out a starboard window of the compass platform just as the sea reached him. Bob Tilburn jumped from the forecastle and narrowly missed being crushed by the plunging superstructure. Ordinary signalman Ted Briggs had left the starboard door moments before, because the squadron navigator, Commander John Warrand, smiled at him and stood aside and gestured for him to go first. Briggs remembered the quartermaster reporting the steering gear gone, and Captain Kerr ordering the change to emergency steering, and then the water coming level with him on the ladder. He was dragged under and then shot to the surface. She lay about 50 yards away, bows vertical, the second turret going under, and the sea around him was 4 inches thick with oil. He reached a small raft. When he turned again, she had gone, and there was a fire burning on the water where her bows had been. Across from him were Dundas and Tilburn on rafts of their own. There was not another soul to be seen. Tilburn put it in 5 words: nobody at all, alive or dead. The destroyer Electra was coming up hard from the south. At 3:25 that morning, her captain had sent a messenger to tell his officers that there would be blood for breakfast. Then the signal went round the ship like wildfire, that the Hood was sunk. They broke out blankets and medical stores and rum and flung scrambling nets over the side, their own boats having been smashed in the davits. What they found was oil and wreckage, hammocks, broken rafts, boots, clothes and caps. Somebody said out loud, "Good Lord, she's gone with all hands." They searched a long time and found nobody else, not even a body, and turned away because there was no more to be done. 1,415 dead of a complement of 1,418. It remains the single worst loss of a ship the Royal Navy suffered in the Second World War. The 3 were about 3 hours in the water and were landed at Reykjavik late that night. 8 minutes had passed between the Hood's first salvo and the end of her, and in them the Bismarck did the thing every navy on Earth had built battleships to do. In the same 8 minutes, she took 3 shells from a half-finished battleship whose turrets kept jamming, and one went into her bow and out the other side without exploding, and nobody in either fleet had yet worked out what it would come to mean. The German ships steamed onto the southwest, undefeated, into a morning already turning against them. Every heavy unit the Admiralty could reach was now coming for them. And under the Bismarck's forecastle, in 2 flooded compartments nobody had photographed, the operation was already over. Chapter 9. The Wound That Nobody Photographed. In the same 8 minutes, an unfinished British battleship with jamming turrets put 3 shells into her, and one of them decided the operation. The Prince of Wales had been completed at the very end of March, some 8 weeks before she steamed into the Denmark Strait. She had never been shaken down, her crew was half-trained, and civilian technicians from the yard were still aboard, working on her turrets while she went north to fight. The forensic historians who later took the whole action apart described her without much charity as a brand new ship with a partially trained crew and unreliable main battery turrets. The record of what her guns did that morning reads like a maintenance log written under fire. In her forward turret, the first gun failed after the opening salvo, from a defect her own engineers already knew about, and 2 more guns of that turret gave trouble with their interlocks. In the after turret, the second gun dropped out from the 14th salvo, The third was lost for salvos 15 to 20, and at the 20th, the turret jammed the ring that carried shells across to its guns. By her 18th salvo, she was fighting the largest battleship in commission, with 7 guns out of 10, and the after turret was only whole again by 25 minutes past 8, hours after there was anything left within reach to shoot at. She was hit 7 times herself. 1 shell went through her lightly armoured compass platform and killed or mortally wounded everyone standing on it except Captain Leach, the chief yeoman of signals and the navigating officer, passing on through without bursting because it met too little metal on the way to trip its fuse. 13 men were killed that day and 9 wounded. At 2 or 3 minutes past 6, Leach laid smoke and turned away, pending, in the careful language of his report, a more favourable opportunity. Out of that ruin of a gunnery performance, 3 of his shells arrived. The first struck aft of the funnel and demolished the captain's motor launch and did no structural damage worth the name. On its way, it passed through the seaplane catapult without exploding and cut the steam line that worked it. Nobody aboard Bismarck noticed. The catapult was not wanted that day or the next, and the wound to it lay quietly in the wreckage of the boat deck until the morning of the 27th, when her officers went to fly off the war diary and found that they could not. The second shell was a short. It fell into the sea, ran on underwater into her port side below the main belt of 320 millimeters, defeated the side protection altogether, and burst against the torpedo bulkhead of 45 millimeters in compartment 14. The turbo generator room behind it filled quickly. The port boiler room flooded slowly through welds that had split under the shock, and the men in there fought it with what they had, plugging the torn seams with canvas hammocks. A steam line was severed and scalded 5 of them. 2 boilers went out of service, and her maximum speed came down to 28 knots. The third shell decided everything that followed. It came in through the 60mm splinter belt on the port bow, passed clean through the ship without ever exploding, and went out the other side, leaving holes some 850mm across, low down under the bow wave, with the ship already trimmed by the head. Later, they covered them over with sailcloth. Compartments 20 and 21 filled with oil and seawater. What that flooding did takes a moment to say properly, because almost every account leaves it vague, and the vagueness hides the rest of the story. The tanks in her bow were never torn open and spilled into the Atlantic. The manifolds of the fuel distribution system stood inside one of the flooded compartments. So did the pump room. So did the access trunks that men would have needed to climb down to reach it. Few navies of that generation gave a tank more than a single supply line and a single suction line, and the list of design faults compiled afterwards puts it in one flat phrase that she had no capability of remote pumping of the forward compartments containing fuel. The oil was still aboard. It sat in her, in the dark, behind a compartment full of cold sea, and the ship could no longer reach into her own bow and draw it out. It was stranded rather than lost, and out in the middle of the Atlantic there is no difference between the two. How much was stranded has been argued over ever since, and the argument has to stand in the telling. The Naval Institute paper says more than 1,000 tons. One standard account gives around 1,000 tons of salt water. Müllenheim-Rechberg, writing decades afterwards, remembered nearly 2,000 tons of seawater in the forecastle. Kennedy gives a further 1,000 tons of oil. Against all of them stands William Durans, who went back to Joseph Statz's flooding diagrams, measured the enclosed volume at 811 cubic meters, allowed for what was already inside it, and arrived at about 608 tons. His own verdict on the larger figures is that the available information would not seem to justify an estimate of 2,000, or even of 1,000. One further correction travels with all of them, and it turns a mechanical story into a human one. She was never in any actual danger of running out of fuel. Every course chosen and every hour lost from here on came out of a fuel picture that was worse in the flag plot than it ever was in the tanks. By the end of the action, she carried a 9-degree list to port and 2 meters of trim down by the bow. What oil remained forward was contaminated with seawater. The flooding was permanent, and the only answer anyone had to it was to flood voids on the port side aft and let her sit lower still. Every attempt to repair her failed, one after another, through the whole of that day. Counter-flooding aft was abandoned when the tips of the starboard propeller came out of the sea. Divers went forward twice to reconnect the tanks in the bow, and twice came back with nothing. Lindemann asked to slow the ship and heel her over so that the shell holes could be welded from the inside, and Lutjens refused him, again without comment. They came down to 22 knots and tried to stuff the holes with hammocks and collision matting, and that failed as well. Boiler room number 2 stayed shut. She had fired 93 of her 353 armour-piercing shells. She had used them to become the most famous ship on Earth, and she could no longer do the one thing she had come out to do. Shortly after 10 in the morning, Lütjens ordered Prince Eugen to drop astern and look at his wake. Brinkmann reported broad streams of oil on both sides of it. The cruiser's own description survives, and it is oddly beautiful for what it describes, that the carpet of oil was broad enough to cover both sides of the wake, was all the colours of the rainbow, and gave off a strong smell. The British could see it too. At 12 minutes past 6, the Suffolk had logged 3 hits observed on Bismarck. At 34 minutes past 7, she logged the enemy appearing to be on fire and losing fuel, which left a broad track for miles, speed apparently 22 knots, and later increasing to 26. Lindemann wanted to turn round and finish the Prince of Wales. Tovey was still more than 300 nautical miles away, and the chase would have taken 2 or 3 hours. Lütjens refused and gave no explanation. Lindemann put the request a second time, more assertively, and was refused again. The reason is documented context, rather than a documented sentence. Raiders' orders were to preserve the ship, and before sailing, Lütjens had told 2 fellow admirals that he did not intend to become the 3rd Fleet Chief relieved of his command for contravening raiders' orders. By 8 in the morning, it was over. With the forward tanks unreachable, he had less than 3,000 long tons in hand, too little for the long, slow work of hunting convoys. The Admiralty's own footnote, appended when Tovey's dispatch was published 6 years later, puts the causation as plainly as an official document ever puts anything, that it is now known that the hit received in the action with the Hood and the resulting loss of oil fuel caused Admiral Lütjens to decide to make for the French coast. At 1 minute past 8, he transmitted his damage report and his intentions to the Naval High Command and named Saint-Nazaire, without consulting either Lindemann or Brinkmann. The extent of the damage never reached Germany at all, which left Raeder in Berlin unable to give a meaningful order to a flagship whose condition he could not assess. Bergen and Trondheim lay a little over 1,000 miles astern of her. Saint-Nazaire lay 600 miles beyond them, and he chose it for longer nights, wider seas, the chance of drawing his pursuers over a line of submarines, and the 2 battle cruisers already lying in France. Brest was nearer, and inside the range of Royal Air Force bombers. Lindemann recommended Bergen. He was disregarded. 5 days earlier, leaving Gotenhafen, the Admiral had told the ship's company that their objective was commerce raiding in the Atlantic, imperiling England's existence, and had given them the hunter's toast, good hunting, and a good bag. The raid was finished before it started. It had run from the 18th of May to 8 o'clock on the morning of the 24th. It had destroyed a battlecruiser, and it had not touched a single ship carrying cargo. The first attempt to detach Prince Eugen came at 20 minutes to 5 that afternoon. The squall was too thin to break the radar contact, and the cruiser was recalled. The second attempt worked. At 14 minutes past 6, she parted company, and the manoeuvre that covered her going was pure theatre. Bismarck swinging back on the shadowing force and driving Suffolk away, the Prince of Wales firing 12 salvos and Bismarck 9, and nobody hitting anything at all. The cruiser went south into the rain, reached Brest, and did nothing whatever with her freedom for the rest of the war. Bismarck steamed on alone into the evening, sagging by the bow, trailing her rainbow, with the radar of 2 British cruisers still riding on her shoulder and the whole width of the enemy's ocean between her and St. Nazaire. Somewhere out in the last of the light, a carrier was turning into the wind. Chapter 10. 30 minutes on the air. At 6 minutes past 3 in the morning, she slipped the shadowing cruisers, and the Royal Navy would not find her again for more than a day. Before that, there was the night and the first aircraft. Tovey's carrier arm went in at 10 minutes past 10 on the evening of the 24th. 9 Swordfish of 825 Squadron flew off victorious under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, followed at 11 by 3 Fulmars, and at 1 in the morning by 2 more as reliefs. Sunset came at 8 minutes to 1. They found her by good navigation and by the search radar in one of the aircraft at 11:30, and turned south to attack from ahead. And then the cloud thickened, and they lost her, and circled, and came instead upon the Norfolk and the Prince of Wales. On the way in, they very nearly attacked the Norfolk. They very nearly attacked an American Coast Guard cutter, the Modoc, which was in the middle of a British and German battle in a war her country had not entered. The confusion woke up every anti-aircraft gunner aboard Bismarck. Her answer to them was to depress her main and secondary batteries and fire into the sea. 15-inch guns were laid flat and made to throw columns of water into the path of a line of fabric biplanes, a wall of the Atlantic itself raised across their approach. It did not work. Not one Swordfish was shot down. One lost itself in the cloud and never attacked at all. 7 torpedoes were dropped and 7 were evaded. The 8th struck at midnight on the 25th of May, and the tally for the whole affair comes to 9 aircraft, 5 Fulmars, 1 hit, and 1 man killed. The torpedo did almost nothing. It hit amidships on the main armoured belt, which is precisely what that belt was there for. It killed 1 man, thrown against the superstructure by the shock. It injured others in the forward starboard turbo generator room in compartment 14, 5 of them severely, or 6. And the discrepancy between the 2 published figures has never been resolved. The electrical damage was minor. What did the damage was the running away. The rapid shifts of speed and course loosened the collision mats over the shell holes in the bow. The flooding forward increased, and the port number 2 boiler room had to be abandoned. A second boiler was gone. With the bow trim increasing, she came down to 16 knots. Divers repaired the mats, and she worked back up to 20, which the command staff judged the most economical speed for the voyage to occupied France. By the morning of the 25th, she had slowed again to 12 knots, so that men could pump fuel aft out of the flooded forward compartments. 2 hoses were connected. A few hundred tons came back. Tovey's own account of the crews who did this to her is the finest thing in his dispatch. They were inexperienced, he wrote. Some of the observers found themselves in a 2-seater aircraft for the first time with a wireless set that had been tuned only on deck and no homing beacon to bring them back. Night shadowing, he added, is a task which tries the most experienced of crews, and it is not surprising that in those conditions they failed to achieve it. The utmost gallantry was shown by the crews of these aircraft in their attempt. Then, at about 3 in the morning, Lütjens gave up the idea of drawing his pursuers over a line of submarines, ordered maximum speed, which was 28 knots by then, and turned her 3/4 of the way round the compass, west and north, and back across her own wake. Timed for the moment, the shadowing cruisers were at the far end of their zigzag and the outer limit of their radar range. It worked perfectly, and the Royal Navy's own verdict on it is unforgiving. The loss of touch, Tovey wrote, was caused primarily by overconfidence. Suffolk was shadowing from the extreme range of her instrument, losing touch on those parts of her zigzag which took her furthest from the enemy. The enemy altered sharply to starboard while Suffolk was moving to port, and by the time she got back, had gone. One detail shows how thin the picture on those screens really was. On both of her last 2 contacts, at 29 minutes past 2 and at 6 minutes past 3, Suffolk detected 2 ships, from which it appeared that Prince Eugen was still in company. Prince Eugen had been gone for 9 hours. Suffolk reported the loss of contact at 1 minute past 4, and the largest battleship in commission with any navy went into the empty Atlantic and vanished. At 9 o'clock on the morning of the 25th, Lutjens began a radio transmission that lasted 30 minutes, and it led directly to his being direction found by the enemy. He had already escaped, and he did not know it. He broke silence, believing he was still being tracked, on the reasoning that a shadowed ship has nothing left to hide. Between the Denmark Strait action and the sinking, he signalled his superior commands 26 separate times. Naval Group West in Paris eventually told him to maintain radio silence at last, and he disregarded that too, being already distrustful of what his own signals intelligence service told him. Brinkman had written the same criticism into Prince Eugen's war diary days before, that the Admiral's insistence on radioing every change of course to the shore commands and then confirming it with a final execute order was unnecessary and risky. The direction finding worked. What happened to it afterwards is the cleanest account of a self-inflicted disaster in the whole operation, and it is in Tovey's hand. At 10:30, a series of bearings came through from the Admiralty, which indicated that the enemy was breaking back across the Atlantic. They appeared to come from the same ship that had transmitted after the torpedo attack of the night before, so they could reasonably be attributed to Bismarck. These bearings, as plotted in King George V, showed a position too far to the northward, which gave the misleading impression that the enemy was making for the North Sea. The bearings were sound. The plotting aboard the flagship was wrong. On the strength of it, the Commander-in-Chief broadcast a false position to every home fleet force at sea and turned his own flagship onto a course of 55 degrees at 27 knots to guard the gap between Iceland and the Faroes against a ship that was steaming away from it. The fleet stayed on the wrong course for 7 hours. When the Admiralty finally made it clear that the enemy was making for a French port, she had a lead of about 100 miles, and Tovey, with his teeth visibly clenched, wrote that the accuracy of the information issued by the Admiralty throughout that stage, and the speed with which it was passed out, were beyond praise. He also conceded a chance he had passed up. A walrus might have been flown off to search astern to the southeast. The swell was such that the aircraft would almost certainly have been sacrificed. Later analysis showed that such a search might possibly have found her. None of it mattered. The 30 minutes had already told the British everything they needed. At Bletchley Park, Jane Fawcett decrypted a Luftwaffe order of that same day, directing support for Bismarck making for Brest. And the French resistance, quite independently, watched Luftwaffe units moving there. The Royal Navy had lost the ship and found the plan. From that hour, she was a hunted animal that had told the hunters where the burrow was. The 25th of May was also his birthday. Günther Lütjens turned 52 that day, and he spoke to the entire ship's company. No German transcript of that speech exists. Gerhard Unack, who survived, said plainly that there was neither the text of the speech nor any report of it in the ship's log. The hour is disputed, given as 11, as 10 minutes to 12, and as noon. The two best-known reconstructions of what he said disagree with each other on their most quoted phrases, and the famous version, the one about fighting to the last shell with the German people watching, comes down through a memoir written 39 years afterwards. The only fragment attested in German is the closing line, that for soldiers it now came down to victory or death. Everything else is reconstruction, and a film that pretends otherwise is inventing. What the speech did is documented far better than what it said, and from both sides of the war. The German account states without hedging that on his birthday, in an address to the entire crew, the Admiral laid bare his hopelessness. The British confirmed it out of the mouths of the men who lived when they interrogated the survivors and found that morale aboard had been very low because Lutjens was driving them towards despair and the preparation for death. The contemporary British file records the effect of the speech on the crew as one of utmost depression. Unack put it in the plainest terms of all. The Admiral overdid it. There was a feeling of depression among the crew which spread through all ranks from the highest to the lowest. Junior officers appeared in life jackets when going to their duty stations. The crew began to brood and neglected their duties. Lindemann spoke to them himself an hour later, trying to undo it. No record of a single word, he said, survives. 2,200 men now went about their watches inside a ship that had been told by its own admiral that it was going to die, and they had another day and a half of running to do before anyone laid eyes on them. She was still missing. She was making 20 knots for France through empty water, and there was not a British ship within reach of her. Chapter 11. A biplane made of canvas. The aircraft that killed her was a fabric-covered biplane, so slow that the most modern gunnery predictors afloat could not solve for it. The Fairy Swordfish was a fabric-covered biplane torpedo bomber, out of date on the day it entered service. Wire, canvas, one engine, and her crew sitting out in the weather. One of the pilots who flew against her that evening said afterwards that the bullets simply went straight through because it was only made of canvas, and that the whole business was like David and Goliath. She had been missing for 31.5 hours when they found her again, at 10:30 on the morning of the 26th of May. The aircraft that did it was a Catalina flying boat, lettered S of 209 Squadron, out of the flying boat station at Castle Archdale on Lough Erne, routed to the ocean through the narrow corridor of airspace that neutral Ireland quietly allowed across Donegal. Her captain was Flying Officer Dennis Briggs. The man at the controls when the battleship came out of the murk below was Ensign Leonard Smith of the United States Navy Reserve, and the United States was not at war. Americans who had ferried Catalinas over were nominally in Britain to familiarize Royal Air Force crews with the type, and were, in the phrasing of the record, unofficially used as co-pilots on operations. Smith jettisoned his depth charges and ran for cloud through anti-aircraft fire that holed the hull. At 14 minutes past 11, the aircraft reported shrapnel damage. At 25 minutes past 11, she lost touch. Smith was given the American Distinguished Flying Cross. That afternoon, Churchill told the Commons that the sighting had been made by one of the far-ranging scouting aeroplanes sent to Britain by the United States. He praised the equipment and said nothing about the man flying it. Even the hour is disputed. Smith's own biographical entry gives the sighting as around 10 minutes past 10, and Tovey's dispatch and the standard accounts give 10:30. She was about 700 miles from Brest. The arithmetic was still against the men hunting her. The first report placed her 130 miles south of Tovey, steering southeast at 22 knots, too great a lead for King George V, unless her speed could be cut. and the only hope, he wrote, lay in torpedo attacks by the aircraft of Ark Royal. His battleships were running dry. King George V had 32% of her fuel left, and Rodney would have to part company at 8 the next morning. Force H had come up from Gibraltar since the 23rd, 1,300 miles from the scene when it was ordered north, and its battlecruiser Renown was forbidden to engage at all. An unarmoured battlecruiser had already been lost that week. The first strike from Ark Royal, 15 Swordfish, launched at 10 minutes to 3 in the afternoon and attacked the wrong ship. An aircraft found a vessel at 10 minutes to 4, 20 miles from where the enemy was expected, and an attack through cloud was ordered. The ship detected was the Sheffield, of whose presence near Bismarck the striking force had not been told, and 11 torpedoes were dropped at her. 2 exploded on hitting the water. 3 more exploded on crossing her wake. The rest she avoided, and she did not fire a single round in reply. Those torpedoes carried duplex pistols, which fired on a ship's magnetic field. 5 of 11 detonated on their own against a British cruiser that was not shooting back. Tovey states the consequence 2 paragraphs later, describing the arming of the second strike, that in view of the apparent failures with duplex pistols in the first attack, contact pistols were employed on this occasion. The whole operation turns on that. With magnetic pistols on the second strike, the torpedo that mattered bursts harmlessly in her wake, and this becomes the story of a battleship that reached France. The second strike went off at 10 minutes past 7 in the evening, or a quarter past by Tovey's own figure, 15 Swordfish, mostly the same aircraft rearmed and refueled. They were sent to home on Sheffield first this time, took their bearing from her at 8 o'clock, could not find Bismarck, and came back to the cruiser at 8:30 to ask again. The attack began at 13 minutes to 9 and ran about half an hour, and 3 aircraft returned to Sheffield a third time for a fresh position. The conditions had gone past the point where any of it should have worked. The ship lay under a cold front, with a bank of cloud based at about 700 feet and topping out between 6,000 and 10,000, and the striking force came apart inside it. The attacks had to be made by subflights or pairs over a long period in the face of intense and accurate fire. And they were pressed home, Tovey wrote, with a gallantry and determination which cannot be praised too highly. It was blowing force 9, and the waves were running 25 to 40 feet, and her guns could not touch them. The reason is on the record in German, and it is the quietest, cruelest fact in the story. The Swordfish were too slow for her modern anti-aircraft fire control, so the range to them was never correctly computed. Her predictors had been built for the fast machines of the coming war. They could not solve for the machines of the last one. Who dropped the torpedo that mattered has never been established. No contemporary document names a pilot. The best-known elimination argument admits of itself that it is really just an assumption. The Fleet Air Arm Officers Association points instead to 2 other crews attacking from the starboard side. The man whose memoir carried the boldest claim of all said the title had been his publisher's idea, and that it was impossible to ascertain whose torpedo had jammed the rudder. Lieutenant Commander Cood's post-strike report that night read, "Estimate no hits. 2 torpedoes hit her. The first detonated just below the main side belt on the port side, outboard of the port engine room, in compartment 7 or compartment 8. It tore the welded seams of the torpedo bulkhead, flooded the port shaft alley, and started slow leaks through joints and longitudinals, and it was inconsequential compared with what came next. The second was the end of the operation." The Admiralty footnote to Tovey's dispatch says it in one sentence, that the immediate and principal cause of Bismarck being brought to action was the hit by the aircraft of Ark Royal, which demolished her rudder and left her out of control. Tovey's narrative gives the deed to nobody in particular. Only to one aircraft that had lost its subflight, went back to Sheffield for a fresh bearing, and attacked alone through very heavy fire to hit her on the port side. 3 clock times circulate, and they are 3 different events. 5 minutes past 9 is the hit itself, from the dispatch. 9:15 is Lutjens' first report that the ship was unmanoeuvrable. About 9:30 is the German signal, from 47 degrees north and 15 degrees west, reporting torpedo hits and an inability to manoeuvre. The most detailed forensic paper gives no clock time whatever in one place, and 3 minutes past 6 in another. Nobody has reconciled them. The mechanism is exact, and it is the reason this ship and no other ended as she did. The torpedo went off on or near the port rudder, 1 to 2 meters aft of the armoured bulkhead at the back of the steering gear compartment. The full fury of the detonation vented inwards, against the plating and against the rudders, and the hull, according to the men standing in it, behaved like a springboard. The steering gear sat rigid inside 150 millimeters of armour, and behind it ran 10 meters of unarmoured canoe-shaped stern that shook at a different frequency from the main hull ahead of it. Both decks in the stern were wrecked, and Seaman Helmut Benke, sent aft to look at the fog-making machinery, found it completely destroyed. She had been turning to port to comb a torpedo track when it struck her, and so the rudders froze in the position her own evasion had put them in, 12 degrees to port. The coupling on the port rudder was badly damaged, and that rudder never moved again. The crew eventually freed the starboard one, and it made no difference. Durans states the outcome without softening it. The starboard rudder was hopelessly distorted and would not move anyway. The port rudder was gone, and with one gone and the other completely jammed, no steering at all was possible. Even the angle is disputed, 12 degrees in the forensic literature by way of Müllenheim-Rechberg, 15 degrees in the German account of Schulze-Hinrichs, who also puts the hit on the wrong day in his own opening sentence. Nobody could get at it. Damage control teams could not even assemble at the stern in the dark, with the after turrets firing overhead. Divers reported to Commander Hans Uhls, the executive officer, that they could not enter the after-steering gear rooms because of the water surging inside them. One gave up when his air hose caught in the torn structure and cut off his air. Joseph Statz, standing in Damage Control Central, heard Uhls say to the exhausted men as they came in that only the diving apparatus issued to submariners would have served. So Uhls ordered the revolutions varied on her 3 shafts to hold her straight on her engines alone. It failed, and it had been known since her Baltic trials that it would fail. Her own trials in the Baltic had already shown that in conditions like these, she could not be held on course by differential propeller revolutions. On the night it mattered, they tried the one thing they had already proved would not work, because there was nothing else left to try. A proposal to blow the port rudder off with explosives went up to Lutjens and was dismissed, on the grounds that damaging the screws would leave her helpless altogether. That story comes down through survivor testimony rather than through any document. The engineering verdict is bleak either way. Part of the stern had probably collapsed onto the rudders, and freeing it would have meant cutting away structure under surging water, work beyond the material carried aboard in any weather and in any battle. There is an eerie doubling here. Prince Eugen had 3 shafts as well. In February of the following year, off Norway, a heavier torpedo took away her stern and rudder, and she steered home on her propellers. Bismarck could not. She turned in circles, and then, as the speed came off her, she settled inexorably onto a course to the northwest, directly towards her pursuers, while the storm got up around her. The gale was force 8, and it blew from the northwest, which was the exact direction of the enemy. Tovey worked it out from course reports alone, from a signal that she had altered to 340 degrees, and another 4 minutes later that she was steering due north, and understood that her rudders had gone, and that the wind was pushing her towards his guns. At 20 minutes to 10, the Sheffield made her last enemy report. Bismarck swung on her and fired 6 salvos at 9 miles, the first a mile astray, the second a straddle whose splinters killed 3 men aboard the cruiser and wounded 2, and 4 more that missed. Sheffield turned away at full speed and made smoke. The ship could still shoot. She simply could not go anywhere, and out in the dark, 5 destroyers were coming up fast. Chapter 12. The Longest Night. She spent her last night steaming in a slow circle she could not break, while destroyers worked around her in the dark. They had not been sent to her. Captain Philip Vian's 4th destroyer flotilla, the Cossack, the Sikh under Commander Graham Stokes, the Zulu under Commander Harry Graham, the Maori under Commander Harold Armstrong, and the Polish Piorin under Commander Eugeniusz Pławski, had been detached by the Admiralty early on the 26th from a troop convoy to screen the battleships. Vian went for Bismarck instead. Tovey wrote about it afterwards with something close to affection, saying that he had known his flotilla captain would do exactly that, and that Vian was wisely proceeding at high speed, in spite of fuel shortage, to get in touch before dark. At 22 minutes to 11, the Piorin, out on the port wing, sighted her, just as the last shadowing aircraft turned away for Ark Royal. 4 minutes later, Bismarck opened a heavy fire on her, and the little Polish destroyer replied, and then turned away under smoke. Pławski charged her alone, while the Maori worked round for a torpedo run, and exchanged fire with a battleship for an hour without either of them scoring, until a 3rd salvo missed the destroyer by 20 yards, and he pulled off. He had never worked with this flotilla before, and had decided to attack last, so as not to get in their way, and in the event, he never fired his torpedoes at all. At 5 in the morning, he was ordered to Plymouth to refuel, and he ignored the order for an hour before he turned away. There is a tradition that he signalled the words about being a Pole, and another that he ordered 3 salvos in honour of Poland, and the literature flags both as possible embellishment. The charge, the hour, the 20 yards, and the refusal to leave are record. Through the rest of the night, the destroyers held on to her in heavy seas, rain squalls, and low visibility. She engaged them frequently and accurately with her main and her secondary armament, laying by radar, and by good handling, they avoided serious damage and took very few casualties. Between 2:30 and 3 in the morning, they fired star shell at Tovey's request, to hang a light over her for the battleships coming down from the north. The damage they suffered amounts to almost nothing. 1 shell sheared off the Cossacks' aerial. 3 shells straddled the Zulu and wounded 3 men, and they did not hit her once. This is the great correction of the story. Tovey's dispatch records hits by the Cossack and by the Maori's torpedo causing a fire on the forecastle, with the Sikh possibly scoring as well. Churchill told the Commons on the 27th that she had been attacked by a British flotilla and hit by 2 more torpedoes, which brought her virtually to a standstill. Modern forensic analysis of the wreck rejects every one of them. 16 torpedoes were fired at her that night, in 9 or 10 separate attacks, and none of them hit. The fire on the bow that the Maori reported as a torpedo strike was almost certainly a star shell that had fallen on her deck and burned itself out. The official dispatch, the Prime Minister's statement to Parliament, and 50 years of popular history were all wrong, and it took the wreck itself to settle it. Aboard, the night was quieter and much worse. The signal had already gone. It said that the ship was unmanoeuvrable, that she would fight to the last shell, and it closed with a salute to the Führer. 3 separate published times exist for it: 20 minutes to 10 on the 26th, 20 minutes to midnight, and midnight itself, all 3 in reputable places. What is undisputed is that Lütjens sent it before the damage investigation had reported back to him. He had decided the ship was finished before he knew what was broken. In his desperation, according to a German account that flags itself carefully as reported speech, he promised the immediate award of the Iron Cross to any man who could free the jammed rudder. Nobody could. The messages that came back from shore made it worse. The mood of the crew grew steadily more depressed as signals from the Naval Command reached the ship, because every message intended to lift them only threw a stronger light on the situation they were actually in. Men who had been told 2 days earlier by their own admiral that they were preparing to die were now being encouraged by radio from a shore that could do nothing for them. Among the flood of signals Lütjens had sent on the 25th was a request that the Knight's Cross be given to Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schneider, his first gunnery officer, for sinking the Hood. The award was dated the 27th of May. Schneider died that morning. Between 5 and 6 in the grey, they tried to fly off the Arado seaplane with the war diary aboard her, and the film of the Hood engagement, and the rest of the documents that would tell Germany what had happened out here. The catapult would not work. The shell that had demolished the captain's launch 3 days earlier had gone through one of the ship's boats and then through the catapult without exploding and severed the steam line. And nobody had known. The wound that nobody photographed reached forward through 3 days and took away the ship's last voice. The aircraft was fully fueled, so they pushed her over the side to reduce the risk of fire and watched her go. At 10 minutes past 7, Lütjens made his last signal. It asked for a submarine to be sent to take over the war diary. The boat assigned was submerged, missed the order, and was nearly out of fuel in any case. The task passed to another, and by the time she could reach the position, there was nothing on the surface to take anything from. There were about 2,200 people inside her hull that night. 2,092 of them were her own ship's company, and 128 were the fleet staff, and with them sailed more than 100 supernumeraries who had no battle station at all. Prize crews put aboard to take over captured merchant ships, cadets, and a film unit sent along to record a raid on the trade routes. The prize crews were never given a prize. The film unit had one action to show for the whole voyage, and the film of it had gone over the side that morning in the seaplane. Below the armour deck, in compartments most of them would never see the inside of again. The ship's company waited at action stations, and where a man happened to be standing that morning was already deciding whether he would live. Josef Statz was 20, at Damage Control Central in compartment 14, deep in her, at the place where every report of flooding and fire arrived, and where Uhls had said the thing about the submariner's apparatus. Heinrich Kundt was 24, in the port turbine compartment, one of the 600 survivors of the cruiser Karlsruhe who had come aboard on the 22nd of April the year before, which was his own 23rd birthday. Müllenheim-Rechberg was 30, high up in the afterdirector, in a steel box with a slit in it, well above the armour deck. The forensic historians who studied the escape routes afterwards found the pattern held with almost no exceptions, and it ran the wrong way round. The men who would live were the ones sealed into the dark underneath the armour, and they were the men least able to see anything at all, and none of them knew it yet. Up in the director, a fellow gunnery officer said something to Müllenheim-Rechberg in those last hours that he never forgot and never dressed up. Today my wife will become a widow, but she doesn't know it yet. At about 8:30, on the upper deck, in the wind, Müllenheim-Rechberg met Lütjens by chance, walking with his first staff officer, Paul Asher. The Admiral looked composed and self-assured, and returned his salute, and walked on towards the Admiral's bridge, and was never seen again. To the northwest, hull down, the thing that had been coming for her since the Denmark Strait was taking its time. Tovey had deliberately put off the attack from sunrise to full daylight because of the gale, and had chosen not to come at her from windward. He ordered the Rodney to close inside 15,000 yards as fast as she could, and left her free to maneuver on her own judgment, an unusual delegation for a fleet commander, because the sight of two battleships steering straight at them, he reasoned, would shake the nerves of the range-takers and the control officers, who had already had 4 anxious days and nights. At 17 minutes to 9 on the morning of the 27th of May, she came in sight of them, bearing 118 degrees, 25,000 yards off, turning slowly and helplessly in the swell, steering as far as anyone could tell from the British bridges directly towards them. The destroyers kept touch until 8:45 and then hauled out of the way. 2 battleships lifted over the horizon into the grey light, and Bismarck could see them and could not turn away. Chapter 13. 90 minutes. At 13 minutes to 9, the Rodney and the King George V opened fire, and for the next hour and a half, nothing about it resembled a battle. The Rodney fired first. The King George V followed a minute behind her. The Bismarck answered at 10 minutes to 9 with her forward turrets, and by 2 minutes past 9, the answering had almost stopped. Tovey had thought hard about the light. He put the attack off from sunrise until full daylight, because the gale was still driving out of the northwest, and he chose not to come down on her from windward, where the spray would have blinded his own rangefinders. Then he did a thing that fleet commanders very rarely do. He turned the Rodney loose, ordering her to close inside 15,000 yards as fast as she could go, and leaving her free to maneuver as her own captain thought best. He set the reason down afterwards in his own hand that the sight of 2 battleships steering straight for them would shake the nerves of the range-takers and control officers, who had already had 4 anxious days and nights. She came in sight at 17 minutes to 9, bearing 118 degrees, 25,000 yards off, steering directly towards them because her rudder allowed her nothing else. For 7 minutes, she said nothing. Then Anton and Bruno spoke together, and her second salvo straddled the Rodney. It was the closest she came to hitting anything all morning. One shell burst about 20 feet off the Rodney's bow and damaged her starboard torpedo tube, and Adalbert Schneider, in the forward director, had done in 2 salvos what most gunnery officers never manage in a career. He had 4 days without proper sleep behind him and a ship that would not hold a course, and he found the target with his second try. Tovey watched her swing and understood exactly what he was looking at. Her fire was accurate at the start, he wrote, though it soon began to fall off, and she made continual alterations of course, but it was doubtful whether these were deliberate. The alterations were the work of a jammed rudder. The helmsman was a passenger. At 2 minutes past 9, a 16-inch salvo from the Rodney came into her forward superstructure. It killed hundreds of men in a moment and wrecked both forward turrets. It destroyed the main fire control director, and with it, in all probability, Schneider. Survivor testimony suggests the same salvo killed Lindemann, Lütjens, and the bridge staff together, in the same second, inside the same box of armour. A hit from the Norfolk sheared the forward radar and the gun director clean off the top of the command tower. In one arriving salvo, the ship lost her admiral, her captain, her gunnery officer, her eyes, and her brain. Other survivors said afterwards that they saw Lindemann on deck as she went down, standing at attention on the bow. Paul Hillen described a man in a white peaked cap and never named him. Rudolf Romer named him, and was already in the water when he saw him. A ship that loses her captain at 9 cannot also have him on her forecastle at 10:30, and men who were there swore to each. The contradiction has never been resolved, and both halves have to be carried. Control passed aft. Müllenheim Rechberg was 30 years old, 4th gunnery officer by his own account, and 3rd by the British file that listed him afterwards, and he was standing in the after-control station with the rear turrets under his hand. He took the main battery. He found the King George V, and he straddled her, which was a remarkable thing to do from a ship already burning fore and aft, and he got 3 salvos away. Then, at 9:13, the world in his optics turned plain blue. It took him a moment to understand. The lenses had gone. His director had been shattered, and the blue was the sky. He ordered the turrets to fire independently. From that moment, there was no aimed fire left aboard the Bismarck. The British had troubles of their own. At 9:20, the King George V lost her forward turret to jammed training gear. The Norfolk fired 4 torpedoes and the Rodney 6 from 15 and from 10 kilometers, and every one of them missed. At 9:18, the Rodney resumed at 9,100 meters, and after that, the range only came down. Between 9:20 and 9:30, with her inside 9,000 meters, heavy shells burst in the Bismarck's machinery. One went into the port turbine room. One went into a starboard boiler room. Joseph Stats, below the armour deck, felt both come in. A fuel oil fire started, and the steam pipes burst, which in a machinery space means scalding vapour under pressure filling a compartment men cannot leave quickly. At 9:27, the forward battery fired its last salvo, and by 9:30, every one of her 4 main turrets was out of action. The forensic account dates it to 9:30 and the operational account to a minute later, a distinction with no meaning at all to anybody aboard. Bruno had 700 millimeters of barbette armour torn away and her rear wall blown off, and she sat pitched forward on her ring, which is what a turret does when it explodes from the inside. Stats could see into her. Caesar took a hit on the faceplate, and the shock of it alone killed the machinery that trained and elevated her. Dora took 3 hits in the barbette, and Müllenheim Rechberg looked aft and saw that one of her barrels had been shredded. The most powerful naval artillery Germany ever built had lasted 43 minutes. At about 9:30, from Damage Control Central, the executive officer Hans Uhls took command of what was left of her and ordered the ship scuttled. Damage control was to cease, every watertight door was to be opened, and the crew were to abandon ship. Gerhard Unack, the senior engineering officer who lived, was told to set the demolition charges with a 9-minute fuse. The intercom had failed, so he sent a messenger up through the ship for confirmation. The messenger never came back. Unack primed the charges anyway and sent his men up the ladders, and they left the engine spaces at about 10 and heard the charges go off beneath them as they climbed. Above them, the shooting went on. Between 9:13 and 10:19, the 4 British ships fired 2,876 shells at her. The King George V fired 339 rounds of 14-inch and 660 of 5.25-inch, the Rodney 380 of 16-inch and 716 of 6-inch, the Dorsetshire 254 of 8-inch, and the Norfolk 527. That is a shell arriving on or around her at an average of 1 every 2 seconds for an hour and a half in daylight, at a target that could no longer move out of the way. Somewhere between 300 and 400 of them hit her by the forensic estimate, and other accounts put it above 400. Somewhere between 10 o'clock and 10 minutes past, a 14-inch shell from the King George V went through the upper citadel belt and burst in the after canteen, 20 to 30 feet inside the ship, and killed about 100 men in a compartment they had gone to because it was behind armour. Oles was among them. The man who had given the order to sink her was dead within 40 minutes of giving it, among sailors who had done exactly as he told them and come up from below. At 3 minutes past 10, the Rodney was 3,700 metres off her starboard quarter, and at one point she came in to about 2,700 metres. Tovey's own figure for the closest range of the whole action is 3,300 yards. Müllenheim-Rechberg, looking out of the afterstation at a battleship that filled the view, said afterwards that he could look down her muzzles, and that if that was her range at the end, then not a single round could have missed. At about 5 minutes past 10, the Rodney fired 4 more torpedoes and claimed a hit, which the forensic team call probable rather than certain, because the sea around her was too thick with shell splashes for anyone to see. Ludovic Kennedy observed that if the claim is true, it is the only instance in history of one battleship torpedoing another. At 14 minutes past 10, the Rodney ceased fire. Tovey looked at what was left and wrote that by 10:15 she was a wreck without a gun firing, on fire fore and aft and wallowing more heavily every moment. At 21 minutes past 10, the King George V ceased fire at 3,700 metres. The gunnery action had run 94 minutes. She had one 20mm gun still working. Every main gun, every secondary, every heavy anti-aircraft mounting was gone. Her colours were still flying. Nobody had struck them, and by that hour there was very likely nobody left alive in the right place to strike them, and she would not sink. Only 2 of the Rodney's 16-inch shells penetrated her 50mm main deck armour in the entire action. The forensic paper that later took the engagement apart put the whole problem into 7 words and printed them in bold. Why did she not blow up and sink? At 25 minutes past 10, the Dorsetshire came in with torpedoes. Tovey had instructed any ship still carrying them to use them on her, and the Dorsetshire anticipated the order, running in on both sides at close range. 2 went into the starboard side, one of them probably striking at or below the turn of the bilge as the ship lay over to port. At 26 minutes to 11, she made her final run on the port side with a torpedo set to run at a depth of 16 feet. It hit superstructure. The list was by then so extreme that a weapon aimed 16 feet below the surface arrived just under the edge of her superstructure deck near the port catapult, and most of the force of 750 pounds of explosive vented straight upwards into the air. The forensic conclusion is that it hurried along a capsize already underway. Between 25 minutes to 11 and 20 minutes to 11, she rolled over to port and went down stern first. The times do not agree. Tovey's dispatch, the primary Royal Navy document, gives 23 minutes to 11. Garsке and Dulin give 25 minutes to 11 for the start of the capsize and 20 minutes to 11 for the end of her. The German Marine Institute gives 21 minutes to 11, and the forensic paper 20 minutes to 11. The position is disputed in the same way: 48 degrees 9 minutes north and 16 degrees 7 minutes west by Tovey, 48 degrees 10 minutes north and 16 degrees 12 minutes west in German sources. Tovey, watching from the bridge of the King George V, set down one line that has outlasted the rest of his dispatch. Men could be seen jumping overboard, he wrote, preferring death by drowning in the stormy sea to the appalling effects of the British fire. They were in the water now, hundreds of them, in a gale, in a spreading slick of her own fuel oil. The Dorsetshire and the Maori turned towards them and began putting ropes over the side. Chapter 14. The Ships That Turned Away. 110 men were pulled out of the water, and then the ropes stopped coming down. Somewhere between 800 and 1,000 men were alive in the sea when she went. The wind was a force 8 gale out of the northwest. The water was the North Atlantic in May, and the sinking position lay about 300 nautical miles west of Brest. Take even the lower figure, and it is the population of a small village, spread across a mile of grey water in oil and floating wreckage, most of them with nothing to hold on to, many of them burned or cut open, all of them watching 2 British warships come towards them and slow down. The Dorsetshire and the Maori stopped and began taking them off. This is the part of the story that refuses to fit the shape people expect of it. The same men who had spent 90 minutes putting 8-inch shells into her now leaned over her survivors with ropes, and a midshipman of the Dorsetshire named Joe Brooks went down the ship's side on a line to help the wounded up her plating, because a man with a smashed arm cannot climb wet steel in a seaway. One German sailor had lost both arms. He was holding onto the rope with his teeth. Brooks tried to get him aboard and failed, and the man went back into the sea. An account published nearly 40 years later gives that same act to the Dorsetshire's torpedo officer instead, and the identity of the man on the line has been contested ever since. What he was doing there has never been contested by anybody. The helmsman Heinz Stadt came up the same side. Ludovic Kennedy describes him gripping the rope with his teeth as they hauled him in, a man who had steered the largest battleship in commission with any navy and had nothing left in his hands to steer with. Then, Müllenheim-Rechberg. They got a rope to him and hauled him up the plating, and at the top of it he could not close his fingers on the rail. He fell back into the sea. They put the rope down a second time and brought him up again, and when he came over the side, he asked them, in the English of a man who had spent his last years before the war as an assistant naval attaché in London, "Please help me on board." It is the smallest line in the whole story, and it may be the most human. A German officer, half drowned, in a gale, in the middle of a war, remembering his manners in the language of the men who had just killed his ship. Josef Staats had gone over at 10:30 with the ship lying at 15 degrees and a wound 8 inches long in his left shoulder, opened by a shell from the Dorsetshire. The sea carried him past her stern at about 25 minutes to 11, and the stern was still attached, a small observation by a wounded man in the water that would matter enormously half a century later. He was within 50 meters of her when she went over. Before he left her, he had climbed the armoured communications tube from damage control up into the conning tower, 7 decks of vertical steel, and had found 5 bodies of the damage control staff lying at the top of it, one of them Emil Jareis. In the water alongside, he saw Lieutenant Friedrich Cardinal. Cardinal's head hung limply in the water. Evidently, Stats wrote, he had carried a pistol. Seaman Moritz died of chest wounds. Seaman Seifert died in the fall onto the wreckage below. Those deaths are recorded because somebody happened to live and write them down. The overwhelming majority of the rest are deaths that nobody can name. The rescue lasted about an hour. At 20 minutes to 12, the Dorsetshire's lookout reported what he took for a periscope. There was no submarine within reach of them. The German boats that morning were low on fuel and out of position, and whatever the lookout saw in that sea has never been identified. It made no difference at all. A cruiser lying stopped with her side open, and men on ropes is not a warship, she is a target, and Captain Martin had his own ship's company to weigh against the strangers in the water. The order went out at once, the engines came on, the ropes stopped coming down, and the 2 ships gathered way with hundreds of men still swimming alongside and calling up at them. Brooks was still over the side when it happened. His shipmates threw him a line as the ship began to move and dragged him back aboard, which is how the one Englishman who had gone down into that water very nearly stayed in it. Nobody agrees on how many came out. Tovey's dispatch, the primary Royal Navy document of the action, records that the Dorsetshire picked up 4 officers, among them the man the British file calls the 3rd gunnery officer, and 75 ratings, and that the Maori picked up 24 ratings. That is 103. The figure in general use ever since is 110, 85 from the Dorsetshire, and 25 from the Maori. Both are citable, and the gap between them has never been explained in any reachable source. The likeliest answers are dull ones. Tovey may have written before the final count came in, or he may have counted only the men landed alive. 2 more rescues followed, and they are the strangest small mercies in the story. At 7:30 that evening, the submarine U-74, the boat that had been given the job of collecting a war diary from a ship that no longer existed, found 3 men in a rubber dinghy and took them aboard: Herzog, Hunch, Manthe. The following night, at 11:15, the German weather ship Sachsenwald found 2 more on a raft, Lorenzen and Maus. The neutral Spanish cruiser Canarias reached the area on the 28th of May and searched it, and on the 30th she recovered 2 bodies. She found nobody alive, though Tovey's dispatch had allowed itself the hope that she might. 115 men were pulled from that water in all. One of them, Gerhard Lütjens, died of his wounds the following day and was buried at sea on the 28th of May with full military honours by the crew of the Dorsetshire. The ship that had fired on him then saved him, then could not keep him. So the British warships came home with 109. The figure normally given for the number of men who survived the Bismarck is 114. German sources say 116. Against that stands the other number, and there is no exact version of it, and there never will be. The reason is simple enough to state. As fleet flagship, she carried a complement of 2,220, made up of 2,092 ship's company and 128 fleet staff. For this operation, she also embarked, in Ludovic Kennedy's words, over 100 supernumeraries, including merchant seamen to act as prize crews for the cargo ships she was going to capture, cadets in training, and a film unit. And then the sentence that closes the question for good. The number of these supernumeraries, and hence the exact number of casualties, is unknown, so the published totals vary by construction rather than by carelessness. Over 2,000 died. Out of a crew of over 2,200, only 114 survived. The German sources are the most precise, giving Lutjens together with a further 2,105 men of the crew, which comes to 2,106. The defensible range is about 2,090 to 2,110 killed, from roughly 2,200 aboard. Which means, in the end, that the film unit sent out to record the triumph of German sea power sits inside the margin of error on its own funeral. Nobody can count the dead of the Bismarck, because nobody wrote down how many people were on the ship. For the next 48 years, that was where the whole matter rested. The men who fired at her said they had sunk her. The men who came out of her said they had sunk her themselves. And the only witness who could settle it was lying somewhere in the deep Atlantic, in a place the Royal Navy had never accurately written down. Chapter 15. Who killed her? When the wreck was found, she was sitting upright on the flank of an extinct volcano with her hull intact below the waterline. Robert Ballard located her on the 8th of June 1989. It had taken 2 expeditions and a search across roughly 100 square miles of seabed, and the reason it took that long belongs to the story, because the effort was hampered throughout by inaccurate British position reports taken in a storm. She had not simply settled onto the bottom either. She had come down onto an extinct underwater volcano standing about 1,000 meters above the abyssal plain, and the impact triggered a landslide 2 kilometers long. She slid down the mountain with it and stopped about 2/3 of the way, and her funnel, her mainmast, and her forward command tower may be buried in the debris of that slide. What is left of her lies embedded in silt to about her normal waterline, and she has no implosion damage. That single absence decides the whole argument, and everything else in this chapter follows from it. When a ship goes down with sealed compartments full of air, the pressure crushes them on the way, and the wreck arrives at the bottom, torn open from within. The after portion of the Titanic is the standard example of it. The Bismarck fell nearly 5 kilometers in about 6 minutes and arrived whole. That can mean only one thing. Her compartments were already open to the sea before she left the surface. The doors were open and the valves had been blown. This is proven, and it is not a matter of national opinion. Ballard's survey found 8 holes in her hull, 1 on the starboard side and 7 on the port side, and every one of them above the waterline. 6 were amidships. 1 was in the deck on the starboard bow, punched at an angle that shows it was made by a shell fired from the Bismarck's own port side, which had passed over her and come down through her forecastle onto the starboard anchor chain. The chain has vanished down the hole. There were 3 splinter penetrations of the upper splinter belt, 1 hole in the main armour belt, and a large hole aft beside the aircraft catapult with no sign of penetration through main or side armour. The fully armoured citadel, the box that held her machinery and her magazines, was never opened below the waterline at all. The survivors had said the same thing for decades without knowing what it proved. Junak, who went over the side before she capsized, saw no underwater damage on the starboard side. Müllenheim-Rechberg reported the same, and assumed the port side he could not see must be worse. James Cameron's expedition of 2002 settled the rest. His team took Russian submersibles down and sent small, remotely operated vehicles inside the hull, the first internal survey anybody had made of her. 2 men who had swum out of her, Carl Kuhn and Walter Weintz, sat aboard the surface ship 61 years afterwards and watched their own ship on a monitor. The mapping that expedition produced is what underpins the finding that the citadel was never breached. So the case for scuttling is physical, and it is strong. At about 9:30, Oles ordered her sunk. The forensic paper is inconsistent with itself on the minute, giving a window between 20 minutes past 9 and 9:30 in one place and 9:30 flatly in another, and the range should be carried rather than tidied away. What was ordered is not in doubt. The hardware is documented down to the box it came in, a small white box marked with a red letter standing for the German word for scuttling, holding 6 sticks of dynamite, a timer and a percussion fuse to be placed on the sea valves and the condenser inlets. It was done in the center machinery space and the aft port turbo generator room and probably elsewhere. And in some compartments, the flooding pumps were simply reversed. The second mechanism is the one most accounts miss, and it may have counted for more than the dynamite. Opening the watertight doors was itself an act of scuttling. Water that had been coming into the battery deck through shell holes could now run downwards through the ship instead of standing where it fell, and that steadily increased the list and eventually took her over. Against all of that stands the case for British action, argued by largely the same authors. Before a single charge fired, she already had a list of 20 degrees to port, and was settling by the stern from flooding that nobody was controlling. Counter-flooding had ceased between 20 minutes past 9 and 9:30, which is to say that the ship had lost the damage control battle before Oles ever gave his order, and the verdict of the very paper that proves the scuttling is blunt. The Bismarck was a sinking ship, and her scuttling merely hastened an inevitable demise. She had been decisively defeated by the gunfire of her British opponents. There is also a finding that cuts strangely against the Royal Navy. Because the battleships were firing into her port side while the cruisers worked on her starboard side, the damage to starboard let in water that balanced the water pouring into port. The British were counter-flooding her for nothing. The forensic view is that the British tactics actually prolonged the battle, and that the Rodney's claimed torpedo hit, if it happened at all, did the same thing. And the blunt assessment of what nearly 3,000 shells achieved is this. The point-blank gunfire devastated her superstructure and the parts of her hull above the waterline and caused very heavy casualties, and it contributed little to the eventual sinking of the ship. So the honest answer is the one the experts gave themselves, twice, 8 years apart. Asked whether the British sank the Bismarck or the Germans scuttled her, Garsker and Dulin answered yes. Cameron, Dulin, Garsker and Durans answered both. What is proven is that she was scuttled, that she showed no implosion damage, and that her citadel was never penetrated below the waterline. What is argued, with something close to unanimous agreement among the people who have examined the wreck, is that she would have gone down within hours in any case. What remains genuinely disputed is only the emphasis, and the emphasis is a question of national pride rather than of evidence. The scuttling decided the hour. The most eloquent thing about the wreck is what is not on it. She has no stern. The forensic team are explicit that they cannot date the failure. It had almost certainly failed structurally during the capsizing, and before that, it had stopped contributing any buoyancy to her at all. The one fixed point in the evidence is a wounded man in the water. Stats was carried past the stern at about 25 minutes to 11 and saw it still attached. Whatever tore it away happened after that, possibly as the ship righted herself on the way down and the water took hold of it. Then comes the design fault, stated by the engineers without a word of qualification. There were no continuous longitudinal bulkheads in the stern aft of the steering gear room, precisely where the fatal torpedo struck. Poor welding, a break in structural continuity, and shell damage to the plating just aft of the armoured bulkhead made the collapse of the stern inevitable. The proof is lying on the seabed around her. In the debris field, there is a large plate from her port side just aft of the steering gear room, identified beyond argument by a unique row of portholes and a straight edge. And that straight edge is a welded joint that failed. And this is the point at which it stops being about one ship. 9 months later, on the 23rd of February 1942, the Prince Eugen took a torpedo in the stern and lost it in almost exactly the same way. Erwin Strobusch, the engineer who directed her repairs in Norway, wrote that this and an earlier collapse aboard the Lutjens indicated a structural flaw in the stern design of German armoured ships. It ran across the heavy cruisers, the armoured ships, and the battleships alike. And the origin lay in the canoe-shaped transom's stern itself, which left those hulls prone to the whipping that travels through a ship when an explosion strikes one of her ends. Through 1942 and 1943, the stern structures of the Admiral Hipper, the Lutjens, the Admiral Scheer, the Scharnhorst, and the Tirpitz were rebuilt. In the Tirpitz, her only sister, the longitudinal bulkheads were extended into the stern during repairs in a Norwegian fjord. Germany admitted the fault and engineered it out. It cost a battleship and 2,000 men to find it, and by the time the work was finished, there was nothing left in the Atlantic to use it on. The forensic teams regard the case as unfinished even now, and want somebody to go back down and look again at the plating aft. The wreck can say how she died, in detail, in bolted steel. It has nothing whatever to say about what she had been sent out there to do. Chapter 16. good hunting, and a good bag. She was built to sink merchant ships, and in 9 days at sea, she did not sink one. Not one merchant ship was sunk by the German heavy units during the entire 2-week operation. Not one was even sighted. The written orders had been unambiguous, that her target was merchant shipping and that warships were to be engaged only where it could not be avoided. And she fought a battlecruiser, 3 battleships, a cruiser squadron, and 2 carrier air groups, and never once put a cargo ship in her rangefinders. On the morning she left Gotenhafen, Lütjens had told the ship's company over the loudspeakers that their objective was commerce raiding in the Atlantic, imperiling England's existence, and he had given them the hunter's toast, good hunting and a good bag. 9 days later, the bag was empty. The account was worse than empty. To support the surface operation, the U-boats had been pulled off the trade routes, and the sinkings collapsed with them. In the first weeks of May, the Atlantic boats sank 29 ships. In the last weeks of May, with the Great Raider at sea, they sank 2. Then the supply network went as well. Enigma decrypts led the Royal Navy to the tankers and store ships one after another through June. The Bletchley, the Gardania, the Gonsenheim, the Esso Hamburg, the Egerland, the Friedrich Bremer, the Lothringen. 7 of the 9 ships assigned to the operation were on the bottom inside 3 weeks. Germany lost the raider, and then lost the machinery for ever sending another one out. Hitler forbade further Atlantic sorties. His confidence in German sea power and in raider began to wane. The Tirpitz went up to Norway and stayed there for the rest of her life, tying down British strength, never fighting a surface action, destroyed at her moorings in the end by aircraft. From May of 1941 until the last day of the war, Germany's entire campaign against Atlantic trade was fought by submarines. 1/4 of the Kriegsmarine's capital ships had been spent in 9 days for nothing at all. There was one more British loss. On the 28th of May, the destroyer Mashona was bombed off Western Ireland, and 46 men died in her. The propaganda war was fought before anyone knew the facts. Churchill stood up in the Commons on the 27th of May, while the shooting was still going on, and told the House that he did not know the results of the bombardment, that it appeared she had not been sunk by gunfire, and that she would now be dispatched by torpedo. Later, after the House had moved on to other business, he rose again, asked with great respect to intervene for one moment, and told them that news had just reached him that the Bismarck was sunk. In the same speech, he told Parliament something untrue. He repeated the operational claim that the destroyers had hit her twice more in the night and brought her virtually to a standstill. The wreck has since shown that of the 16 torpedoes the destroyers fired at her through that long night, not one hit. The Prime Minister said it in good faith on the strength of a signal, and it stood as history for 50 years. The most famous order of the whole story is not a documented order at all. Sink the Bismarck, as everybody quotes it, is the title of a film and of a song, drawn from a novelist's book about her last 9 days. The Admiralty knew where the credit belonged and said so in public. Its message of thanks, printed in the Times on the 29th of May, stated plainly that had it not been for the gallantry, skill and devotion to duty of the Fleet Air Arm in both Victorious and Ark Royal, the object might not have been achieved. 2 carriers and about 24 fabric-covered biplanes had done what 5 capital ships could not. On the German side, the handling of it was clumsy and sad. Naval Group West went on signalling a ship that was already on the floor of the Atlantic until Reuters carried the British announcement. The regime was then forced to admit the loss in the Armed Forces report of the 28th of May, earlier than it had wanted to, and the death of the fleet commander was mentioned only obliquely. His widow learned that her husband was dead from that broadcast, the day after he died in his own flagship. She lies 4,791 meters down, about 650 kilometers west of Brest. There is more than 19 times her own length of water between her decks and the daylight. All 4 of her main turrets fell out of her as she rolled, because a turret of that weight sits on its ring and nothing holds it in when the ship goes past the vertical, and they lie in the sediment around her now. One swung outboard as she went over, then rotated another 45 degrees as she settled stern first. Another was driven inboard by the water and lies, with its guns pointing forward instead of out to the beam. They record the violence of her last minute more exactly than any witness could. Garske's closing line on the state of her stands as well as anything written since. She now rests on the Atlantic seabed, upright, defiant, and proud. Ballard never published her exact position. He kept it to himself to stop divers going down to take pieces off her, a practice he considered a form of grave robbing. The site is treated as a war grave, and nothing has been taken from her. The survivors carried on with their lives. Heinrich Kundt, who had placed and fired the charges in the port turbine compartment, met the sailor from the Maori who had pulled him out of the sea, in Plymouth, in 1977. He retired in 1980 from the Max Muller Company, the firm that had made the Bismarck's 15-inch shells. Bernhard Hoyer was 18 years old on the day she went down, the youngest name on the survivor list, and he was the last of all of them, dying on the 7th of March in 2018 at the age of 95. 77 years he carried it, and the man this whole story has run through carried it longest of all. Burkhard von Müllenheim-Rechberg was born in Spandau on the 25th of June 1910 and was 30 years old when the Dorsetshire's rope came down to him. He was the highest-ranking man to come out of her alive, and he had fought the after-turrets for as long as there was anything left aboard to fight with. He was taken first to England and then to a prison camp at Bowmanville in Ontario, and he was promoted while he was inside the wire. After the war, he read law at Frankfurt, entered the Federal Foreign Office in 1952, and served as an ambassador in Africa and a consul general in Canada. In retirement, he wrote the book that became the classic survivor's account of the ship. He died at Hersching am Ammersee on the 1st of June 2003, aged 92, 62 years after he came out of that water. Historians have been careful with him, and so should anyone telling this story. He was aft when the story was forward. He did not see the bridge, or the men who died on it, or Oles give his order, or the charges being set in the machinery spaces. Almost every famous moment of the Bismarck reaches the record through a man who was 300 feet away from most of them. But one thing he saw with his own eyes and felt in his own body, on the deck of the Dorsetshire, dry and alive among the men who had saved him, he confronted her captain and demanded to know why the rescue had been broken off so suddenly, and hundreds of his shipmates left to drown. Captain Martin told him to leave that to him, that he was older and had been at sea longer, and that he was the better judge of it. Decades later, an old man who had spent a whole second career in the service of a different Germany, Müllenheim-Rechberg, wrote that he had become convinced that under the circumstances, Martin had to act as he did. That is as near to a verdict as this story permits. The senior surviving German officer forgave the English captain who left his friends in the sea, and it took him most of a lifetime to do it. Tovey wrote his own verdict within weeks. The Bismarck had put up a most gallant fight against impossible odds, worthy of the old days of the Imperial German Navy, and she went down with her colours still flying. Everything that killed her had been settled the evening before the Rodney ever fired. The armour was correct. The gunnery was superb, and she straddled a battleship with her second salvo at 25,000 yards after 4 days without sleep. The stability was, in the engineer's own word, perhaps excessively good, and none of it was joined to anything, because on a black evening on the 26th of May, A biplane made of canvas and wire, flying slower than her own predictors could solve for, had put one torpedo into a patch of unarmoured plating aft of the steering gear bulkhead. It bent one rudder and tore the other away and left the largest battleship in commission with any navy turning into the weather in an arc she could not break. No contemporary document names the pilot who dropped it. The man usually credited with it spent the rest of his long life saying that it could not be known whose torpedo had done it, and that it did not matter to him in the slightest. He was right about that. What mattered was where it went. 823 feet of battleship, 4 days of the largest naval hunt in history, and the torpedo found the 2 meters of her that had nothing behind them. If this one stayed with you, subscribe, because there are more ships and more endings still to come. And tell me in the comments what you would have done on that bridge, with a periscope reported and hundreds of men still alongside. Would you have gone back for them, or done exactly what Captain Martin did?